All right. Welcome, everybody, to Standing for Truth. My name is Donny, and I am your host and moderator for tonight's debate between CJ Cox from the Synagogue YouTube channel and Dan Chapa on theistic determinism and modalism. Specifically, we are debating the question, is theistic determinism biblical? Now, we've hosted probably now over 250 debates on all sorts of topics, but this is the first time we're specifically debating this important question. So it's also awesome to have a new face. Always good to have new faces here. Dan Chapa, thanks so much for giving us your time. Typically, we start with intros, kind of break the ice before we get into the opening statements and the debate itself. So Dan, why don't we start with you, since it's your first time here on the channel? A little bit about yourself, how you doing tonight, and a little bit about your channel, website, whatever you got.
Hey, thank you, Donny. Thanks for having me on, and thanks, CJ. Looking forward to this discussion. So I guess my background, I'm a Christian. God saved me when I was very young, when I was about 6 years old. And I've been trying to learn more about the scriptures and grow in my faith and dig into God's word. And he's brought me on this journey. And, I was a Calvinist, I guess, in college a little bit. When I first saw Romans 9, I didn't have a different explanation for Romans 9. But once I dug into it a little bit more, I changed my views. Now I think I land I'm somewhat of an Arminian, although I do hold to perseverance of the saints. And I'm a Southern Baptist, so I have that type of soteriology. I also hold to total depravity, so I guess I'm a 2-point Calvinist, but which is really an Arminian. And then I'm also a Molinist, and that's probably what's most relevant for this debate in terms of God's providence. So I've been looking forward to this discussion, and I appreciate you guys. So thanks for having me on.
My pleasure, Dan. Great to have you. You've had a number of big debates that I've watched. Same with CJ. So one could say you're both seasoned debaters. And so this will definitely be one to remember. Dan, we got you coming back here a couple times more in the next month. So we've got you in January debating Joshua Gibbs. This will be a soteriology debate, the great salvation debate, free grace theology versus lordship salvation. You will also be here again in December debating Turretin fan, and we'll be debating specifically limited atonement. So that should be fun as well. Okay, CJ, good to have you back as well, brother. How have you been? A little bit about yourself and a little bit about the synagogue.
Thank you very much. And so shalom to you all. For those who don't know, my name is CJ Cox. I run the YouTube channel, The Synagogue, which is a apologetics and theology YouTube channel dedicated to doing apologetics from a specifically fundamentalist and reformed standpoint. I recently have been doing a lot of kind of holiday related stuff and talking about Catholicism and Mormonism, but for the most part, we talk about all different topics that are related to apologetics and, and theology. The main thing that we have as our sort of shtick there is I like to, number one, reclaim the term fundamentalism. I think that it's got an unnecessary negative connotation when in reality it just means that you hold to the fundamentals. It's an entirely good thing. It's those who are opposed to modernism, and I think all of us should strive to be associated with that. And then, of course, being reformed, I tend to talk a lot about predestination, perseverance of the saints, total depravity, stuff like that. So that's sort of the main shtick that we kind of have there. And I'm definitely happy to have a conversation here with Dan today. It's my first conversation with him. I saw at the debate that he had done with, I think it was Turretin fan who was with you, but you guys debated Albrecht and Shamoon. That was fantastic. So I'm happy to be going up against somebody who I think is a very solid debater here today. And thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Thank you so much there, CJ. And also to Dan. Gentlemen, thanks for your intros. To the audience, if you like what you're hearing from both Dan and CJ during tonight's debate, I do have their relevant links in the description box where you can click and you'll be able to find more about them. So real quick, though, before we get into the opening statements and I go over the format, I do want to let everybody know that we had a debate 2 nights ago. We had yesterday off, but now we've got 3 debates in a row. So starting with this epic debate on is theistic determinism biblical? And then we will be back here tomorrow night with a debate on oneness. Is oneness biblical? Between Kelly Powers and John Barton. And then on Saturday night, we've got a solid soteriology related debate for you. Do all believers persevere? Lordship salvation versus free grace theology. So we're getting a lot in on this topic. Charles Jennings and Turretin fan. So I know there's been a lot of hype for this. And I just set 2 big events last night. So these are taking place in January. So I'm now booking for 2023. And here's a couple of the main events. So if you're not yet subscribed, please do make sure to hit that subscribe button. You don't want to miss all the upcoming shows we have for you. This is going to be Dr. Stephen Boyce and Will Kinney. This is more of an informal debate. So nonetheless, they have opposing views, but it is going to be more of an informal discussion. This is going to be fun. King James only, question mark. So that's in January. And then we've got a big eschatology debate here as well. 2 pastors, Pastor Matt First, Pastor Daniel Aldridge, and they'll be debating the rapture, pre-trib or post-trib. So with that, let me go over the format real quick. So we've got a formal one tonight, 15-minute opening statements, followed by 10-minute rebuttals, uninterrupted rebuttals. Then we're going to have a 50-minute discussion. How we've got the discussion portion structured is we're going to break it up into 2 rounds. So we're going to have 25-minute cross-exam and then another 25-minute cross-exam. Then we'll have 5-minute closing statements where the debaters can wrap up their thoughts and points. And then this is where we get you guys in the audience involved. We're going to have an audience Q&A, roughly 25 minutes. So just make sure you're tagging me with your questions at Standing for Truth, and that way I won't miss them. Okay, so with that, the title for tonight is Theistic Determinism Biblical. CJ Cox would say yes. Dan would say no. CJ's in the affirmative, and therefore, CJ, we are going to hand it over to you, my good man. And whenever you're ready, you've got a 15-minute opening statement. The floor is yours.
All right, just 1 second. I got to let my dogs in. That's going to be about 5 seconds.
Take your time. Take your time. So again, to the audience, I see everybody making their way in. And so please tag me with your questions, and that'll be the best way I don't miss them. Okay. So anyway, CJ, that was quick. Got to take care of those dogs. I hear you, brother. So whenever you're ready, the floor is yours. Go ahead.
Thank you very much. So I want to say shalom to everybody here, and God bless you all in the name of our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. Welcome to this episode of Unapologetics. I'm just kidding. Anyways, I appreciate every single one of you guys being here. Appreciate the audience for participating in their listening. I appreciate Brother Donny here for setting this up, and I appreciate Brother Dan for having this conversation with me. This is a in-house conversation, in my opinion, so I think it's always fun to have those, namely because we can see just how passionately we can disagree, even despite things being in-house. And I suppose the most passionate conversations you have are with family. But anyways, today's conversation is going to be, of course, about whether or not theistic determinism is biblical. And I am going to be taking the affirmative position here. To lay out really quickly my views on this, number one, I am a compatibilist. So for those who do not know, there is 2 different sort of flavors, if you will, of determinism. There's hard determinism, which is to say we fatalistically have no free will or anything like that. And then there is what is known as soft determinism or compatibilism. That basically suggests that free will and exhaustive divine determinism are actually not mutually exclusive, but rather can both be true at the same time. And that is the position that I take today. That's the position that I think is taught by Scripture. I also want to lay out really quickly, even though this conversation will focus primarily on the biblical arguments, that I don't actually think this is an avoidable issue. In other words, I don't think that we can take any interpretation of a monotheistic creator God in the world, whether that be Christian, Jewish, Muslim, Sikh, doesn't matter. I think all of them ultimately will have to end up back at this position. And as a result, I'll be perfectly honest with you guys, it would be pretty difficult to convince me that this was not the case. Not only do I believe that the Bible teaches this, but I also believe logically and philosophically it is an impossible conclusion to avoid. I only want to share that with you guys just because, everybody wants to know, are you open-minded and that kind of stuff? And I'll be perfectly honest with you, not really. I used to be one who believed in libertarian free will. I went kicking and screaming into Calvinism, and now I'm here. So let's get right into this. I want to go ahead and share my screen because we're going to be going through a couple of different scriptures, actually really much more than a couple, but I digress. We're going to be focusing on the scripture here today. Donnie, let me know when I got that up. Awesome.
You're
And
good.
we're going to start here with Genesis chapter 41. And this is where Joseph interprets the dreams of Pharaoh. Remember, Pharaoh has two different dreams. They trouble him quite a bit, right? And he goes to all the different magicians and wise men, but none of them can interpret the dream. So his butler says, oh, hey, I remember this guy who interpreted my dream. His name was Joseph. And we get the whole story from there, right? So if we go forward here to the portion where Joseph is speaking, he says, let's see. Pharaoh said unto Joseph, I have dreamed a dream, and there is none that can interpret it. And I have heard say of thee that thou canst understand a dream to interpret it. And Joseph answered Pharaoh, saying, it is not in me. God shall give Pharaoh an answer of peace. And Pharaoh said unto Joseph, in my dream, behold, I stood upon the bank of the river. And behold, there came up out of the river 7 kine, fat-fleshed and well-favored, and they fed in a meadow. And behold, 7 other kine came after them, poor and very ill-favored and lean-fleshed, such as I never saw in all the land of Egypt. The lean and ill-favored kine did eat up the first 7 fat kine, and when they had eaten it up, it could not be known that they had eaten them, but they were still ill-favored as at the beginning, so I awoke. And then, of course, he goes into a second dream, but nevertheless, you get the idea. 7 of something good being devoured by 7 of something bad, right? Now, when Joseph starts to interpret these, he says, Joseph said unto Pharaoh, the dream of Pharaoh is one. God had showed Pharaoh what he is about to do. Okay? God has showed Pharaoh what he is about to do. Not what's about to happen just kind of randomly. This isn't some deistic mechanism where God is like wound up the little doll and the doll is now walking and doing its own thing. Rather, God is actually the one who's going to not only send the plenty here, but he is also the one who is going to send the famine. It's his doing, right? And he explains what it is, talking about 7 good years and 7 bad years. This is the thing which I have spoken unto Pharaoh. What God is about to do, he says again 3 verses later, he showeth unto Pharaoh. And he goes on to say later on that this is shown twice because it is an assured thing. Now, this is particularly interesting, not only because God is the one determining both the plenty and the famine here. In other words, both the good and the bad are determined by God. But this is actually something that's very vital to a plan that God is working out as we see in later chapters. This is chapter 45, starting at verse number 5. Now, therefore, be not grieved, nor angry with yourselves. This is Joseph speaking to his brothers. Remember, Joseph's brothers sold him into slavery and initially actually wanted to kill him, but God, through Reuben, actually restrained them to only sell him into slavery. Now, therefore, be not grieved, nor angry with yourselves that ye sold me hither, for God did send me before you to preserve life. Notice he says God sent him to preserve the life. Okay. Well, how was he sent into Egypt in the first place? He was sent by way of these people selling him into slavery. And then eventually the people who bought him initially, the Ishmaelites, selling him to an Egyptian named Potiphar. And then, of course, Potiphar's wife falsely accusing him of rape. A lot of really kind of negative things here. And yet what he says is God actually sent me. This was God's doing. And he continues, for these 2 years hath the famine been in the land, and yet there are 5 years in which there shall neither be earing nor harvest. And God sent me before you to preserve, notice again, God sent me before you to preserve a posterity in the earth and to save your lives by a great deliverance. Notice he had a plan here. He had a plan to get Joseph into Egypt so that he could save the posterity of the 12 tribes from the famine he was going to send. Notice he's responsible for all of it. He's responsible for getting Joseph there. He's responsible for sending the famine. He's responsible for sending the plenty. God takes credit for all of these things. Notice what Joseph says here. So now it was not you that sent me hither, but God. And he hath made me a father to Pharaoh and lord of all his house and a ruler throughout all the land of Egypt. Notice Joseph actually goes so far as to say, not only did you send me here, but actually, or did God send me here? But actually, because it was God's plan, I'll take all of the credit away from you and say it was not you who sent me here, but rather it was God. And Joseph repeats this again in the much more popular Genesis 50 and verse 20. And Joseph said unto them, fear not, for am I in the place of God? But as for you, ye thought evil against me, but God meant it unto good, to bring to pass, as it is this day, to save much people alive. Notice that what they intended for evil, what these people did negatively, sinfully, wickedly, God meant, it wasn't him picking up the cards and trying to, work with what he had here. God wasn't, so this is what happens. I think I'm going to go with this instead. No, God meant it for good to bring to pass as it is this day to save much people alive, and save much people alive from what? The famine that he himself already took credit for sending. So he's the one who sends Joseph here. He's the one who sends the famine. He's the one who sends the plenty. Sounds an awful lot like divine determinism to me. There are, of course, other instances here that we can go to. This is Genesis chapter 25, and it reads, these are the generations of Isaac, starting at verse 19, Abraham's son. Abraham begat Isaac, and Isaac was 40 years old when he took Rebekah to wife from the daughter of Bethuel the Syrian of Padan Aram, the sister to Laban the Syrian. And Isaac entreated the Lord for his wife because she was barren, and the Lord was entreated of him, and Rebekah his wife conceived. And the children struggled within her. She said, if it be so, why am I thus? And she wept to inquire of the Lord. And the Lord said unto her, 2 nations are in thy womb, and 2 manner of people shall be separated from thy bowels, and the one people shall be stronger, than the other people, and the elder shall serve the younger. Notice he says, before anything has happened, the elder shall serve the younger. Malachi chapter 1 takes this concept and runs with it. Says, starting in verse number 2, I have loved you, saith the Lord, yet ye say, wherein hast thou loved us? Was not Esau Jacob's brother, saith the Lord? Yet I loved Jacob, and I hated Esau, and laid his mountains and his heritage waste for the dragons of the wilderness. Now, very quickly, it is important for us to note that when it says I hated Esau, it's not talking about God having some kind of personal vendetta against Esau. The word hated in Scripture is very often used to indicate somebody who is favored less. For example, it is said that Leah was loved less than Rachel in one verse, and then in another verse, it is said that Leah is hated. That informs us as to how this word hated is being used, right? It's not that he has a vendetta against Esau. It's that he is favoring Jacob. And how is he favoring Jacob? By passing the promise of Abraham and Isaac to his seed and not to Esau's seed. But notice he says, I have loved you, saith the Lord. I hated Esau and laid his mountains and his heritage waste for the dragons of the wilderness. So again, we have this idea that one of these people is favored and the other person is not favored. Romans 9 takes this and runs with it even further, right? Not as though the word of God hath taken none effect, for they are not all Israel, which are Israel, neither because they are seed of Abraham are they all children, but in Isaac shall thy seed be called. That is, they which are the children of the flesh, these are not the children of God, but the children of the promise are counted for the seed. Continuing. For this is the word of promise, at this time shall I come, and Sarah shall have a son. And not only this, but when Rebekah also had conceived by one, even by our father Isaac, get this now, this is verse 11, for the children being not yet born, neither having done any good or evil, that the purpose of God according to election might stand, not of works, but of him that calleth, it was said unto her, the elder shall serve the younger. As it is written, Jacob have I loved, but Esau have I hated. Notice what God is saying when we put Genesis 25, Malachi 1, and Romans 9 together, which of course is how it's intended, right? At least if we believe in the inspiration of Scripture. He is saying before they had done anything, before there was good or bad, before there was any sort of sin within them or righteousness within them, I, God, chose to send the blessing through Jacob and not to send it through Esau. Esau gets modern day Jordan or Edom and the promised land, and the 12 tribes and the prophets and the Torah and Messiah eventually are going to come through Jacob before anybody had done good or bad. Why? That the purpose of God according to election might stand. And this chapter continues to say, what shall we say then? Is there unrighteousness with God? What's the number one response you tend to hear there? Oh, are you saying God is the author of evil? It's interesting because Paul addresses that exact question in the next verse. Is there unrighteousness with God? God forbid. For he saith to Moses, I will have mercy on whom I will have mercy, and I will have compassion on whom I will have compassion. So then it is not of him that willeth, nor of him that runneth, but of God that sheweth mercy. For the scripture saith unto Pharaoh, even for this same purpose have I raised thee up, that I might show my power in thee, and that my name might be declared throughout all the earth. Pause from this for a moment. Let's go to Exodus. And God says here in Exodus, scroll down here. This isn't where I'm supposed to be. Let's see here. Moses returned to Jethro. That's not where I want. This is now, the Lord said to Moses in Midian, go return to Egypt, for all the men who sought your life are dead. Moses took his wife and his sons and set them on a donkey, and he returned to the land of Egypt. And Moses took the rod of God in his hand. And the Lord said to Moses, no, catch this. This is very important. When you go back to Egypt, see that you do all those wonders before Pharaoh, which I have put in your hand. But I, who's speaking? The Lord said to Moses, but I will harden his heart. Not he will harden his own heart. Not this, that, and the third circumstance will happen, so I'm going to have to pick up the cards and do what I do. No, I, God, will harden his heart so that he will not let the people go. Then you shall say to Pharaoh, thus says the Lord, Israel is my son, my firstborn. So I say to you, let my son go, that he may serve me. But if you refuse to let him go, indeed, I will kill your son, your firstborn. Back to what we were reading in Romans. And he says, and of course, this is explicitly stated later on in Exodus, but nevertheless, even for the same purpose have I raised thee up, that I might show my power in thee. So notice, I will harden the Lord. I will harden Pharaoh's heart. Why? I have raised you up for this purpose, that I might show my power in thee, and that my name might be declared throughout all the earth. It's as clear as day. God set up this particular Pharaoh. God hardened his heart, and then God did the mighty works that he was going to do through Moses so that he could show his power through this disobedient and arrogant Pharaoh. Continuing here in Romans 9. Therefore he hath mercy on whom he will have mercy, and whom he will he hardeneth. Thou wilt say unto me, why doth he yet find fault? That's another interesting response we constantly get from the non-Calvinist. How does God find fault in us if he predestined everything? Interestingly enough, I have never once heard a non-Calvinist get these two responses from their exegesis of Romans 9. That should tell you something. If Paul is anticipating certain responses and then answering those responses, and 5 views over here never get those responses, but one does, that should tell you that the one is probably interpreting the text correctly, but let's continue. That will say then unto me, why doth he yet find fault? For who can resist his will? Nay, but, O man, who art thou that repliest against God? Shall the thing formed to him say that formed it, why hast thou made me thus?
30 seconds.
Thank you, brother. Hath not the potter power over the clay of the same lump to make one vessel unto honor and another unto dishonor? Notice, of the same lump to make one unto honor and another unto dishonor. Predestination language. And we can continue. We can't right now because of the fact that we have time, but we could go to Isaiah 45, Isaiah 10, Amos 3, Romans 11, Acts 2, Acts 4. It's all over the scripture. Predestination is indeed the will of God. And to be honest with you, I would like to see responses from this that suffice, because thus far in the last 500 years of Reformed conversation, we have not been able to see them. I yield the rest of my time, and thank you for having me today.
Okay, CJ, thank you so much for that 15-minute opening statement. We're now going to hand it over to Dan Chapa. Dan, whenever you're ready, the floor is yours, and you also have 15 minutes.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm ready to roll. All right, so good evening. I'd like to start out with thanking Donny and CJ for pulling this debate together and agreeing to participate. I've been looking forward to this and I've been excited about it. I'd also like to start out with a definition for tonight's topic. So the specific topic is Theistic Determinism Biblical? Then after providing definitions, I'll argue that the scripture teaches that we choose. I'll provide 4 arguments against determinism and then explain why God's sovereignty does not imply determinism. So the first word I'd like to define is determinism, since it's in the topic itself. And for this, I'm going to use a quote from Calvinist philosopher Guillaume Bion in his book, Excusing Sinners and Blaming God, a Calvinist Assessment of Determinism. He says, the main idea behind determinism is that everything that comes to pass is determined or necessitated by prior conditions. Then he's got a footnote on this point, and the footnote says that the conditions in view can be either temporally or logically prior, thus leaving room for a timeless God to cause things to occur in time. So on theistic determinism, God's decree necessitates everything, every event in creation, every thought, and every action. The second term I'd like to define is the word cause. Here, Guillaume says that this is how he defines cause. Agent A engages in an activity that necessarily results in the occurrence of event E. So with this definition in mind, it seems that God's decree, when he determines, it is a cause. Now, I'm happy to get into what type of cause is it. Is it a primary cause versus secondary cause, proximate cause versus remote, eternal versus temporal cause, physical versus spiritual cause? Happy to get into those details, but it is some type of cause. On Guillaume's definition, right, God's activity necessarily results in the occurrence of every event in the created order. So God's decree is some type of causal determinism. The third term I'd like to define tonight is the word choose. Choose is defined as to select from a number of possible alternatives. That's according to the American Heritage Dictionary. I actually looked this up in about 20 different dictionaries, and that's just a common way of defining choose or choice. The next point I'd like to make is that the Bible uses the word choose, which is, again, to select between possible alternatives. Deuteronomy 30:19 says, I call heaven and earth to witness against you today. I have set before you life and death, blessing and curse. Therefore, choose life that you and your offspring may live. A few verses earlier, Moses says, but the word is very near you. It is in your mouth and in your heart, so you can do it. So Moses is going out of his way to point out the alternatives, and he's going out of his way to point out the ability. You can do it. And you can see just by the definition of the word choose that it's between alternative possibilities. Now, when you think of your own personal past choices, that's when you realize, well, I could have chosen otherwise. At Gethsemane, Christ asked Peter, James, and John to stay up with him. And then he comes back and he finds them sleeping. And so here's what Christ says in Matthew 26:40. So could you not have watched with me 1 hour? Now, Christ is asking a rhetorical question. Christ is saying that they could have stayed awake 1 extra hour, and he's blaming them for not having stayed awake 1 extra hour. So the Bible teaches that we're the source of our choices, and we can choose otherwise in the sense of real alternative possibilities. Now, here's the fundamental problem with determinism. If determinism is true, then we can't choose otherwise than we're determined. But if we can choose, then we can choose otherwise, because that's just part of the definition of the word choose. So if we hold to real choice and to determinism, we have the contradiction that we can and cannot choose otherwise. Likewise, choosing otherwise is both possible and impossible. And finally, the conditions for our choices are both sufficient and insufficient. Now, minimally at this point, we can say that there's a strong sense in which if determinism is true, we can't choose otherwise. So if Peter had been a theological determinist, he could have said, you decreed me to sleep. Staying awake was impossible for me. Now, I very much look forward to hearing how CJ avoids this contradiction. He did define his term in terms of compatibilism. I'm interested in his definition of determinism and his definition of the word choose also, but we'll hopefully get a chance to get into that. Now, the second argument I'd like to make against determinism is based on deliberation. Luke 14:31 says, or what king going out to encounter another king in war will not sit down first and deliberate whether he is able with 10,000 to meet him who comes against him with 20,000? And if not, while the other is yet a great way off, he sends a delegation and asks for terms of peace. Now, here's the thing. We don't deliberate about things that we consider impossible. We don't think about doing things that we consider impossible already. So the combination of these three beliefs are incompatible. 1, I can win the war. 2, I can negotiate. Then 3, given determinism, I cannot both win and negotiate because one is necessary and the other is impossible. Now, if you're paying attention to me tonight, you're doing so voluntarily. Could you focus on something else? Can you direct your consciousness on something else right now? If you need to be determined to start focusing in the first place, would you ever even take the initiative to focus your mind on what I'm saying? Now, my third argument is based on the introduction of sin into the world. Genesis 1:31 says, and God saw everything that he made, and behold, it was very good. Adam and Satan didn't have sin natures or desires that were evil before they fell, nor were they ignorant of God's commands. Whatever God created was good. Evil was something radically new introduced into creation. The Bible doesn't attribute Adam and Eve's sin to God, but rather they were the source of their sins. Why did they fall? The only answer that the Bible gives us is that sin came into the world through one man. That's Romans 5:12. Likewise, Ecclesiastes 7:29 says, "See, this alone I have found, that God made man upright, but they have sought out many schemes." Further, God specifically puts distance between himself and sin. He says that he's not the source of sin. In 1 John 2:16, we read that the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of the life is not of the Father, but of the world. Now, God hates sin, and sins are not him. Sins are not of him. So sin wouldn't even be possible if God didn't give us this type of freedom. So we are the primary cause and ultimate sources of our sins. Likewise, in Romans 1:20, we're told people are without an excuse. In Isaiah 5:3, we're told God invites us, and he invites us to judge him to make sure that he is being just. He says, "Judge between me and my vineyard." In Ezekiel 18:25, God says, "Are not my ways equal? Are not your ways unequal?" In Luke 19:22, we're told, "Out of your own mouth I will judge you." So we shouldn't appeal to mystery when it comes to moral responsibility. Now, if theistic determinism is true, it seems that Adam and Eve would have an excuse. God could have determined them not to sin. Instead, God determined that they sin rather than obey. And they would not have sinned if it wasn't for God's determination. Everything was good in the world until God determined their sinful actions. And they didn't have a choice about God's determination, and they didn't have a choice that God's determination would necessitate the first sin. Now, my fourth argument is based on testing, and God's using testing to deepen our personal relationships and walk with him. In Exodus 16:4, we're told, "Then the Lord said to Moses, Behold, I will rain bread from heaven for you, and the people shall go out and gather a certain quota every day, that I may test them whether they will walk in my law or not." Notice the alternative possibilities of walking in God's laws or not. In 1 Corinthians 10:13, we're told, "No temptation has overtaken you, but that which is common to man. God is faithful. He will not let you be tempted beyond your ability. But with that temptation, he'll provide a way of escape that you may be able to endure it." The last time I sinned, God enabled me not to sin. That was a real alternative possibility that I had. I can't say that God didn't give me enough grace to avoid sin. God uses tests to deepen our relationship with him. In John 4:23, we're told the Father is seeking people to worship him in spirit and in truth. These tests and deepening of relationship with God aren't possible if God determines if we sin or not. Now, next, I'd like to address the idea that if God is sovereign, if God has plans, if God is in control, then determinism must be true. No, determinists do not have a monopoly on the idea that God is in control. Right? The scripture is filled with ways in which God controls things, whether or not determinism is true. Let's first look at divine permission. God knows how to prevent sin, and permission is the opposite of prevention. So in divine permission, God could put down barriers or obstacles that would keep us from sinning or prevent sin, but God chooses not to for his own reasons. Right, and to bring good out. But so in Genesis 31:7, we're told, "Yet your father cheated me and changed my wages 10 times, but God did not permit him to harm me." So divine permission is definitely a biblical concept that we need to wrestle with. Now let's look at the opposite of permission, of prevention. Let's look at the opposite of permission, which is divine prevention of sin. So God can stop us from sinning. God can take away our life, like he did with Elijah when the soldiers were trying to take him to Isaiah. God sent down fire from heaven in 2 Kings 1:19. God can decrease our abilities, right? Jeroboam was prevented from grabbing the prophet by the drying up of his own hand in 1 Kings 13:4. God can arrange for an opposition of a greater capacity or one that's at least equal. So the priest prevented Uzziah from burning incense to Jehovah in 2 Chronicles 26:18. And there's also an opposition and a battle within our own hearts between the flesh and the spirit. Galatians 5:17 says, we are told that the flesh desires what is against the spirit, and the spirit desires what is against the flesh. These are opposed to each other so that you don't do what you want. God can withdraw the object, our goal of our sinful actions, so we don't even try in the first place. The Jews were frequently hindered from hurting Christ because he withdrew himself from the midst of them in John 8:59. God can bring out outcomes that we don't intend. Proverbs 16:9 says, "A man's heart devises his way, but the Lord directs his steps." God can use signs to control outcome. So Nebuchadnezzar, he had determined he was going to conquer the nations, right? And so he starts coming south, and he faces a fork in the road. He can go right or he can go left. If he goes left, he's going to attack the Ammonites. If he's going to go right, he's going to attack the Jews. God managed the divinations, and so that Nebuchadnezzar resolved to march against the Jews rather than attacking the Ammonites in Ezekiel 21:19. God can determine the right time to permit sin, even if that timing is different than the time that we want. So in John 7:30, we're told the Jews sought to take Jesus, but no man laid hands on him because their hour had not yet come. But when the time was right, we're told, yet when the time before appointed of the Father approached, Christ said to them, "This is your hour, the power of darkness." That's Luke 22:53. God can limit the duration of sinful actions. We're told in 2 Peter 2:9, the Lord knows how to deliver the godly out of temptations. God can limit the opportunity to sin. In Hosea 2:6, we're told, "Therefore, I will hedge up a way of thorns, and she will look for her lovers, and she won't find them. Then she'll say, I'll go and return to my first husband." God can limit the amount of trials or temptations we go through, like with Job. God told Satan in chapter 1, don't touch him. But then in chapter 2, God tells Satan, touch his bone and his flesh, but save his life. God can send angels to help us. God can restrain Satan and the demons from harming us. God can use our own self-hardening to accomplish his plans, like he did with Pharaoh when Pharaoh hardened his own heart. God can judicially harden our hearts and give sinners over to their own reprobate minds, like he did with Pharaoh when he hardened Pharaoh's heart, as we see in Exodus, and also it comes up in Romans 9, and the giving over the reprobate mind is in Romans chapter 1. Now,
1 minute.
Okay, thank you. God didn't even have to create us in the first place, and he sustains us in existence. In Hebrews 1:3, we're told that Christ upholds all things by his powerful word, and we wouldn't even exist if it wasn't for God sustaining us in existence. God can use his knowledge of what we would do. In Exodus 3:19, we're told, God said, "But I know that the king of Egypt will not let you go unless compelled by a mighty hand. So I'll stretch out my hand and strike Egypt with all the wonders that I will do it." Notice one of the reasons for God sent the plagues is that he knew that Pharaoh wouldn't freely let the Israelites go under other circumstances. So it's not enough to say that God has a plan or God is in control. No, you have to get into the details of how God determines things. And unless God's decrees are absolutely necessary, or unless our actions are causally determined, we haven't established determinism by just saying God has a plan.
Okay, Dan, thank you so much for that 15-minute opening statement. Clear and concise opening statements from the both of you, Dan and CJ. So this is definitely going to be an awesome debate. Lots of excellent points to discuss. We've got the 10-minute rebuttals before we get into the cross exam. So CJ, we're going to hand it over to you. And whenever you're ready, you've got 10 minutes. The floor is yours.
Thank you, brother. And I'll go ahead and jump right into the rebuttal today. So the first thing I want to address is, Brother Dan said here that the Bible says clearly that we choose. And I agree wholeheartedly. Again, compatibilism is the idea that exhaustive divine determinism and genuine free choice are compatible with each other and not mutually exclusive. And that is the position which I want to defend today. Now, most philosophers will give two definitions of what constitutes a free choice. There is a group known as incompatibilists who would define free choices as a choice which is not determined. I think that is entirely untenable, and hopefully we'll be able to get into that today. But nevertheless, there tends to be, for the most part, two different definitions of what constitutes a free choice. One is known as sourcehood, in other words, the ability to do what you will, and another is the possibility of alternative choices. In other words, you can decide either to drink the tea or to not drink the tea, right? And I suggest to you guys that both are perfectly compatible with divine determinism. And in fact, both are typically accepted not only by divine determinists, but also even by secular compatibilists as well. I would also like to point out to you guys that amongst libertarian free will proponents and Molinists, they do not actually have agreement as to what constitutes a free choice. For example, William Lane Craig does not believe that you need to have a possibility of making an alternative choice in order for a choice to be genuinely free, right? And likewise, compatibilists, there are many who would suggest that you do, in fact, need that ability in order to be considered genuinely free, right? So I would suggest to you guys that it is both true. Actually, I'd say three things true. Number one, we do what we genuinely will. Number two, we have the mental and physical capacity to do otherwise. And number three, God exhaustively determines all things. I do not believe that those things are mutually exclusive. And I think the Bible demonstrates exactly that. What do I mean? Well, we already read that Joseph says in 2 different points of Scripture, 3 different points if we want to include him sending the famine, that he is the one, God is the one who sent him to Egypt in order that he might preserve the posterity of the 12 tribes. And yet, if you've ever read Genesis chapter 37, it's not like there's some divine spirit coming down and possessing the individuals to do what they do. It's not like somebody's putting a gun to their head and saying, do X, Y, and Z. It's not like somebody is using the puppet strings and saying, all right, bump, 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 bump over here. Let's go and do that. No, rather, they, out of their own wicked hearts, decide they want to sell Joseph into slavery. So how is that possible? How can he say, God's the one who sent me here, giving God the credit? And also, we read in Genesis chapter 37 that they schemed on their own accord. Compatibilism, right? In other words, God is working out his plan through the means of human free choice, and we do actually have a level of free choice. Now, I would also point out here to you guys that this is a street that only works one way. I, as a divine determinist, can make room for genuine free choice if defined by sourcehood or principle of alternative possibilities. The libertarian free will advocate cannot actually do the same the other direction, right? If we can find even one instance where God has predetermined something and also the individuals at play are considered morally responsible and acting in accord with their own free will, then libertarian free will has to fall by the wayside. This is not a two-way street. It is a one-way street. And we just demonstrated to you that in fact is the case. People who are determined to do something and yet somehow are also morally culpable and working in their own free choice. And there's tons of other examples we could give, friends. Let's go to Isaiah chapter 10 real quick, and I'm going to go ahead and share my screen to do so. Let me pull it up here. Isaiah chapter 10, here we are. This is starting at verse number 5. God says through the prophet Isaiah, O Assyrian, the rod of mine anger. Pick up a rod, friends. How does it work? You go. The rod does not swing itself. You swing the rod. And this is the rod of mine. Who's mine? God's anger. Okay? Assyrian, the rod of my anger. In other words, the instrument that I am actively using to punish someone. The staff in their hand is mine indignation, says God. I will send him against an hypocritical nation. Notice I, God, will send him against an hypocritical nation and against the people of my wrath. Whose wrath? God. Will I give him charge, that is command? God will give them command to go against the people of his wrath. To do what? To take the spoil and to take the prey and to tread them down like the mire of the streets. Howbeit he meaneth not so. The Assyrian does not mean to be an instrument of God's divine wrath. The Assyrian has his own wicked motivations. Neither doth his heart think so, but it is in his heart to destroy and cut off nations, not a few. So notice here we have God, and God is actively taking credit for swinging the rod at Israel, and yet he's also saying the rod has its own motivations, right? Again, we see perfectly compatibilism here. The Assyrians wish to conquer, wish to rape, wish to steal, wish to plunder, wish to put themselves up as great. And God wishes to punish wicked Israel. And he'll even punish wicked Assyria for the thing that he determined them to do. Continue to read the chapter. You will find that to be the case. However, I am limited on time, so I am not going to be able to continue there. I guarantee we'll get get to it later on because that's a pretty bold claim on my part. Stopping the sharing here. So yes, we do choose, but yes, everything is determined. They are not mutually exclusive, and the Bible plainly teaches that that is the case. Next, I want to point out here that he says Adam and Eve had no evil desires. If Adam and Eve have no evil desires, how is it possible that they could have desired to sin? That makes absolutely no sense, right? The fact that they did commit a sin indicates that they had the capacity to sin, right? If they had absolutely no capacity to sin, as we will when we get to heaven, then it wouldn't make sense for them to actually commit a sin, namely eating from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. It makes absolutely no sense. They have to have had the capacity to sin in order to commit the sin in the first place. It's kind of like saying human beings have no capacity to flap their wings and fly. But if I just did that and started levitating, that wouldn't be true, would it? Right? So it's the same kind of thing that we have going on there. He says sin is not attributed to God, but is attributed to the individual. Not only is that true, but that is something which Calvinists have for a very long period of time already accepted. This is from the Westminster Confession, which I do not believe is binding, sola scriptura alone, but nonetheless, sola scriptura alone, that's pretty redundant, right? Anyways, but nonetheless, it says, God from all eternity did, by the most wise and holy counsel of his own will, freely and unchangeably ordain whatsoever comes to pass. Yet so, as thereby neither is God the author of sin, nor is violence offered to the will of the creature, nor is the liberty or contingency of second causes taken away, but rather established. In other words, this is something that we as Calvinists for a very long period of time, we're talking centuries at this point, 1689, we're 100 years before George Washington is inaugurated president. We have always recognized that God ordains all things, and yet also the free will of the creature is not actually violated. Rather, it's established through that. And I also want to point out through this, we talked about this idea of, well, God can do this, that, and the other thing in order to prevent us from sinning. And if I may be so bold, that's exactly part of the point. Calvin once famously said that there is absolutely no difference between God ordaining and permitting things to take place. And that is exactly true. Let me demonstrate to you why that is. Let's go back to the garden. Okay. God had the opportunity not to create Adam and Eve, but he did. He had the opportunity not to create the serpent, but he did. He had the opportunity not to create the devil who possessed that serpent, but he did. He had the opportunity not to create the tree of knowledge of good and evil, but he did. He had the opportunity not to put it in the midst of Adam and Eve, but he did. He knew exactly what Adam and Eve would do if he did all those things, and then he let it happen. He knew exactly what the results of Adam and Eve doing those things would be, and yet he let it happen. In other words, how can we possibly say God has the ability to create or not to create? He knows exactly what's going to take place. He's intimately aware of details, and yet somehow he actually creates and the whole thing moves forward, and we're going to say that's not determinism. That makes no sense. If I let a lion go in the middle of a kindergarten and it starts to eat some children, are you going to say that that wasn't my fault? Well, the lion chose to do it. Yeah, but I knew what I was doing. Now, God knows what he's doing, and he's got holy purposes for what he is doing. Everything works together for good for those who are called according to his purpose. However, it makes no sense whatsoever for us to say God is eternal, transcendent, omnipotent, omnipresent, omniscient, and he allows things to take place. That does not work. The other thing I would like to point out here very briefly before we end is, again, we know for a fact there are at least some acts which are determined and which God holds people morally accountable for. We already pointed out the selling of
10 seconds.
I'll actually leave it here with just saying the crucifixion, and we'll move on later on to the rest of the conversation. But nevertheless, that is not a two-way street. It only goes one way in that particular regard, as I explained earlier, and I'll yield the rest of my non-existent time.
All right. Thank you, CJ. I know as a fellow debater, these 10-minute rebuttals, they fly by. So thank you so much, CJ, for your 10-minute rebuttal. Dan, we're going to hand it over to you now. And whenever you're ready, the floor is yours for 10 minutes.
Sure. So I think part of the tricky part here is going to be the definition of terms. So if I understood correctly, CJ is defining free will in terms of sourcehood and alternative possibilities. Obviously, I agree with sourcehood and alternative possibilities. And he's saying that we have the ability to do otherwise, which obviously I agree with. So if that's true, then I think I would have to ask for a definition of determinism, because determinism has to necessitate events such that they can't be otherwise. In other words, we can't do otherwise than what God has decreed for us to do. So if we can choose otherwise than what God has decreed, then that's not determinism. And so I think that's really where the rubber's going to hit the road. But I think we're going to have to flesh that out in cross-examination. The second thing is, and again, this is a definitional point, but compatibilism is not the compatibility of moral responsibility and determinism. I'm not saying it's irrelevant. It is relevant, but that's not the definition. It's between freedom and determinism. So specifically in the case of Pharaoh, which CJ got into a little bit in his opening presentation, Pharaoh was hardened by God. Now, it was a judicial punishment. So first, God comes to Pharaoh and says, "Hey, let my people go." And Pharaoh says, "No, who is God?" And then he commands that brooks be made without straw. Then later on in the narrative, he hardens his own heart, and then God hardens Pharaoh's heart eventually. Whatever the sequence of event, and there's some question as to in Exodus 7, but whatever the sequence of events, we know that before the hardenings happened, Pharaoh sinned. He refused to let the Israelites go, and he commanded bricks without straw, and then God punished him for that. We also saw in my opening presentation how God knew that that's what he would do, and that's why he was planning to bring the plagues. So while Pharaoh was being hardened, it's quite possible that he didn't have the ability to do otherwise then. But there is a tracing issue to his previous sins and his hardening his own heart, but most specifically to his own sins. And God, as a punishment, can harden hearts. It's a scary thing. We obviously want to obey while we have that opportunity, because we might come under the hardening of God. Although I don't think God hardens believers the way he hardened Pharaoh. But in any case, but that is an example of where somebody is held responsible and they don't have the ability to do otherwise at that moment. But there is a tracing issue to where Pharaoh, before he was hardened, he did have so the hardening is kind of the exception that proves the rule, right? So the hardening being a subtracting of grace. Well, before the heart was a little bit softer and could have at least provided some outward obedience. I wouldn't say it's like pure, true obedience, but at least some type of outward obedience. Whereas, frankly, Pharaoh, once he was being hardened, sorry, Pharaoh, but you're acting stupid. I mean, right? Like common sense is gone at that point, right? These plagues are coming, and he just keeps on bringing it. Isaiah 10 and the rod of God's anger. So, I can understand why CJ uses that passage, but I'd say it is an analogy, and I think we can't press the analogy too far. You look for what are the relevant differences rather than pressing every aspect of the analogy. So there's relevant similarities and relevant differences. The relevant similarity is God is in control, and God uses nations to punish other nations. That much is a very the main point of that passage. The relevant similarity is not choice. Rods don't choose, people choose. Okay, so the next one, let's see. Okay, so Genesis, Genesis 45 is interesting. So Genesis 45:8 says, "Therefore it was not you who sent me here, but God." Okay, I don't see how this could be used to support compatibilism at all. I'd like to hear more about that, but what Joseph is doing, so Joseph's rhetorical message to his brothers is basically chill out, listen to me, calm down, stop being so scared. But let's look at what he actually says here. In verse 50, he says, "Don't be afraid," right? Am I in the place of God? And then in 45, he says, so I'm going to read Genesis 45, 4 through 8. Joseph said to his brothers, "Come near to me." And they came near. "I'm your brother Joseph," he said, "the one who sold you into Egypt. And now don't be worried or angry with yourselves for selling me here, because God sent me ahead to preserve life." Okay, so he's literally telling them, don't be angry with themselves. So if you press this language in that way, I mean, what is he saying? Like, don't repent? No, there's certainly a sense in which they perform these sins, not God. So what is this language? Well, it's very common that the scriptures will say that something God permitted and directed towards a good end, like this, that God did it. And I think we can see that in Job, right? Job says, the Lord gives and the Lord takes away. But in the narrative, it specifically said that it was Satan that was doing it. Well, no, because God permitted Satan and directed it towards a good end. It uses the language that God did it. But if you press the point and say, no, God did it, they didn't do it, because that's what the language says, well, then he's excusing them. And that's not compatibilism at all. Right? Compatibilism isn't the idea that we don't do anything. God does it in our place. So, okay, so let's see. Other points to bring up. The Romans 9:1. I'm going to say I agreed with almost everything CJ said about Romans 9. I'd love to get into it. I'll try to spend as much time as I can on Romans 9 to finish out here. So let me go ahead and bring up the text. And I almost want to say I'm not going to be able to do Romans 9 justice in this amount of time, but I'm going to give it a shot, a run through, a very quick exegesis. In verse 6, we're told, "It is not as the word of God failed, for it is not all who are descended from Israel who are Israel." Okay, this is probably the verse where Calvinists and non-Calvinists start to get off track. When Paul uses the phrase "the word of God," you can see several times he uses it as the gospel. Right? And so it's not that the gospel has failed, but not all who are descended from Israel are Israel. So there's two Israels. There's a physical Israel and there's a spiritual Israel. There's a physical Israel who certainly were the chosen people. They were given the land and the law and many other blessings. I think they're still God's chosen people. I'm not a replacement theologian. But in any case, there's a physical Israel and then there's spiritual Israel. So who is spiritual Israel? Paul's already defined that in Romans chapter 4. That's believers. Those that are of the faith are blessed with faithful Abraham, as we hear in Galatians chapter 3. Romans 4, Romans 2 talks about spiritual Jews are the ones that are regenerated. They have the circumcision of the heart. So spiritual, that's believers. Now, here's the problem. It is not the elect before they come to faith. They're not spiritual Israel yet. They'll become spiritual Israel. God knows that they'll become spiritual Israel, but they're not yet spiritual Israel until the believers. Okay, the passage goes on. Neither are they all children because they are descended from Abraham, but on the contrary, through Isaac your offspring will be called. That it is not the children of the physical descent who are God's children, but the children of the promise are counted for the offspring. Again, that's believers. For this is the statement of the promise. Okay, this 9 is key. This is the statement of the promise. So what word of God hasn't failed? As I said before, that is the gospel. At this time I will come and Sarah will have a son. Okay, this is the second time in Romans that Paul has brought this passage up. Right, he's referring back to Genesis chapter 18 when Sarah laughs when she hears that she's going to have a kid, and what Romans chapter 4, what Paul uses this in Romans chapter 4, this very passage.
1 minute.
When Abraham believes this promise, he is justified. Now the promise is of an upcoming son. But when the promise is believed, that person is justified. Now, the promise is of that national lineage that Christ is going to come through. They're going to have the law. They're going to have the land. It's about the national blessings. And then it repeats. And not only this, but Rebecca also received a promise, the gospel. And she became pregnant by one man, even our ancestor Isaac. So she's told the same promise. She's told the elder will serve the younger. So it's the same idea. So the national blessings, that promise, when it's given, when the Old Testament saints believe that promise, they were justified. I wish I could spend more time on Romans 9. Like I said, I won't be able to do it full justice, unfortunately, in this format, but hopefully that was helpful.
Well, thank you, Dan, for that 10-minute rebuttal. Gentlemen, and to the audience, that concludes the 15-minute opening statements and also the 10-minute rebuttal. So again, we've got a lot of excellent points to discuss as we move into everybody's favorite part of these formal debates, the cross exam. And so Dan did just end with his rebuttal. So CJ, we're going to give you the first 25 minutes to lead the way and cross-examine Dan. As you're doing that, again, to remind the audience, I am all up to date on the questions. Great questions so far. Just make sure you're tagging me at Standing for Truth, and that way I won't miss them. So with that, gentlemen, the floor is yours. CJ, we're going to hand it to you for the first 25 minutes. Go ahead.
Thank you, brother. Before we get in, I just want one quick clarification. According to the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, it says compatibilism offers a solution to the free will problem with concerns, which concerns a disputed incompatibility between free will and determinism. Compatibilism is the thesis that free will is compatible with determinism. Because free will is typically taken to be a necessary condition of moral responsibility, compatibilism is sometimes expressed as a thesis about the compatibility between moral responsibility and determinism. So that is, I think, necessary to what we're discussing here, because I think that that's the main concern of the incompatibilist, is how do we hold moral responsibility here if indeed everything is determined. With that being said, I want to actually, you just ended on Romans 9, so let's jump into Romans 9. And go ahead.
Did you want to ask a question about that first point you made? I can, we can chat about that if you want to. It's up to you.
Well, the main point there was just to say, kind of like why. So, because you had said that it's not necessarily about moral responsibility and determinism. I just wanted to kind of express that at least amongst the majority of philosophers, that is one of the alternative ways which they would express the thesis, is the moral compatibility, the compatibility between moral responsibility and determinism.
So that's the most interesting case, of course, obviously, and I think that is, I would wholeheartedly agree, especially with respect to the garden, to the fall. That is true, but I don't think it's the only motivation to hold to libertarian free will. Especially, I think faithfulness to the scriptures is a second motivation, which focuses more so on the language of the ability to do otherwise and what exactly that means, rather than our moral intuitions about responsibility. So I would say that you don't have to, for a libertarian, they don't have to say in each and every time somebody is responsible, that means they're not determined. In fact, you'll find people like Kane and Tempe saying exactly the opposite, and they're leading libertarian philosophers.
Definitely fair enough. So actually, before we get to Romans 9, I want to lay out a couple things here that I think will be relevant. The first is, how would you personally define libertarian free will? I word it that way because there are, I think, some contradictory answers there. For example, Alvin Plantinga and William Lane Craig do not agree on what necessitates a libertarianly free choice. So what would you define as libertarian free will? Okay.
Yeah, good question. So it's going to be the absence of determinism. So it's definitely, we have free will, and we're not determined. So the question is, well, what exactly do we mean by determined? And the two most important ones is something isn't absolutely necessary, or kind of by definition necessary. And then the second one is the absence of causal determinism, like a cause and effect relationship, like fire burns paper, that sort of thing. So neither of those can be the case. And we have free will.
Okay. And so then the next definition I would want here is, what would you say is your definition of determinism?
Right. So it's the opposite of that. So okay. So great question. Actually, appreciate that. So determinism is going to be a type of necessity or impossibility imposed by something, In theistic determinism, obviously, it's done from God's decree. So the first type of determinism that would definitely rule out libertarian free will is if God himself does not have libertarian freedom, right? So if somebody tries to make an argument, let's say based on God's aseity or his relationship with time, that who God is determines what God does, such that God had to save Esau, couldn't save Jacob, that sort of thing. Or God had to bless Jacob, he could not have blessed Esau. So if somebody says that based on who God is, then everything is absolutely necessary, and there's no way we have free will. So that's going to conflict with it. The second type of determinism that's going to conflict with libertarian free will is causal determinism. And so like I said, if it's like fire burns paper. Now, we can allow for spiritual type of causation. I believe in an immaterial soul. So there can be spiritual cause and effect. And if it works just like physical cause and effect, then determinism still holds good. And if what we do is causally determined, then we don't have libertarian free will. So those are the two biggies, I guess. Hopefully that's enough to work with.
Yeah, and then my last question here, in as far as the definitional kind of thing is concerned, is related to the definition read from Stanford Encyclopedia. Do you believe that a determined action can carry moral responsibility? In other words, if I'm determined to do something, can it be fair to say that I'm morally responsible for having done it?
The only case that I can think of is judicial hardening for past sins, but has a tracing condition. So, for example, I think that Pharaoh had libertarian free will, and then he sinned, and then as a punishment for that sin, God hardened his heart. Now, while his heart was hardened, I'm at least open to the idea that he was determined at that point and still held morally responsible. So I think that's the only thing I can think of that's an exception. But that's as far as moral responsibility goes. I would also say when somebody is being hardened like that, they don't have a choice. They can't choose in the sense of Deuteronomy 30.
Okay, and so just to make sure I got this correctly, libertarian free will would be free will that is absent of any determinism. Determinism would be a necessary truth in a cause and effect type way, like fire burning paper. And determinism's relationship to moral responsibility would be, yes, if you are determined, you can be morally responsible, but if and only if you have kind of put yourself in that situation via your previous free choices. Is that all accurate?
So the only qualification I'd make is on the necessary truth point. So here I got to make a distinction. That's really, you're getting into the details, but that's really good. So there's an absolute necessity, like God exists, right? Anything that happens, no matter what happens, God exists, right? There's no possibility that anything's going to, God exists, right? No possible world where he doesn't exist. Okay. Now there's a relative logical necessity, which is if this, then that. Right. And so that is like a definition of a term, but you can okay, so you can quickly tell, hey, there's a difference between a definition and a term. That relationship, which is a correspondence logical relationship, and a cause and effect relationship like fire burning paper. Those are two different things. So when it comes to logical necessity, the one that threatens libertarian free will is what I would say is an absolute necessity, like God exists. But the one that doesn't is the incompossibility of a combination. So, for example, a syllogistic necessity. So, based on all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is immortal. That's a necessary conclusion. You can't come up with any other conclusion. But that process, that logical relationship, does not threaten libertarian free will. So it's only the absolute logical necessity and causal determinism. Those are the two. Absolute logical necessity, like God exists, and causal determinism, like fire burns paper.
All right, thank you for that. So now then, let's, with that, jump into some of the more specific biblical points here.
Great.
And I think that'll be helpful for everybody. Shoot, 1 second, I gotta let my dog in. All right, sorry about that. So I'm going to pull up here Genesis 45, which I think will be useful because that was one of the questioned ones here as well. So, now therefore be not grieved nor angry with yourselves that ye sold me hither, for God did send me before you to preserve life. So first question, the phrase, for God did send me before you to preserve life. Do you agree with me that that is a statement of determinism on God's part? In other words, God determined for Joseph to be in Egypt such that this life would be preserved through him?
No. So I got to make a distinction. So if you mean by determinism, God made up his own mind. Yes, he did. So God made up a plan. And so God had a couple different things he could plan, and he planned one of them. So if that's all you mean by determinism, then yes. But if you mean that he determined what the brothers would do, no, he used persuasion, because if I seem to remember, it was like, Joseph is in the pit. And so that they're arguing back and forth. Should we kill him? No. Let's sell him. So that's like an argument and persuasion. So it's more of a persuasion response rather than cause and effect relationship there.
So to be clear, though, so are you saying then that it was not necessarily in God's plan up until this had happened, or was before the foundation of the world, before anything has ever been created, right? No Adam, no Eve, no creation at all. Did God want Joseph in Egypt to save these brothers from the famine?
You ask such tough questions. Okay, I'm going to say no on the want, but yes on the plan. So he planned for it, but not because he wanted the sin. So the way I explain that is like the robot vacuum. Okay, so let me see if I can run through this really quick. So let's say you want to throw a party and you're going to invite a bunch of friends over. You know they're going to make a mess. They're going to spill popcorn all over the ground. But you have a great new Roomba and it's going to clean everything up for you. So you got a solution to that. All right. So the reason to invite them over is because you want to have the party, right? It's not because you want them to spill the popcorn. So in that sense, God did not want the brothers to sin, but he knew that they would, and he had a perfect solution for it, the robot vacuum, right? So in that sense, he didn't want it to happen, but it still was it was known, and it was part of his plan, and he was going to bring a greater good out of it.
So let's say that they did not sell him into slavery. At that point in time, God obviously has this plan of a famine in the timeline that we exist in now, right? This famine that's going to take out everything. Hypothetically speaking, let's say that God does not send the famine because Joseph is not sent into Egypt, right? If that were the case, do you think there would be more or less sin, suffering, and things of that nature? In other words, does the famine lead to more suffering, more sin, or does it lead to less suffering, less sin?
Less suffering.
So you would say that because we have the famine, there is less suffering.
Yeah. So, okay. So yeah, right. Because God brought out basically the blessings to Joseph, but to Jacob and his whole family, including the brothers and the Egyptians and the surrounding nations. So yeah, less suffering. I think God brought a greater good out of permitting this sin.
So I would agree that he brought a greater good, but I guess my point is to say, so in order for there to be a famine, it follows that people are starving, and it follows that at least some of those people would die, right?
Okay.
Now, God sends the famine so that he can, God sends Joseph to Egypt so that he can protect these brothers from the famine. If Joseph is not in Egypt and also there is no famine, there's none of this starving and there's none of this death that comes from said famine. There's no necessity for Joseph to save them because there's no famine, right? So why would God have the scenario where we have no famine, no starving, and also, for the record, no selling Joseph into slavery, versus the one where Joseph is sold to slavery, but also no famine or anything like that? Or what we have, Joseph is sold into slavery and also there is a famine. It seems to me like the option we get has significantly more suffering and sin involved than either of the other two options, namely Joseph being sold into slavery and there being no famine, or Joseph just not being sold into slavery.
Okay, so I think I'm following your point. I think we both probably agree that God is bringing a greater good out. So probably where we disagree is, did God want the sinful actions? Did God want the suffering? But so I'm going to say no. He wants to throw the party, not for the friends to spill the popcorn. And then where we also are going to disagree is that God tested the brothers, right? And they could have done the right thing or the wrong thing. God knew that they were going to do the wrong thing, but he tested them. And that part of the greater good that he brings out is a deeper relationship with many people, including Joseph, but many others. So that relationship involving their choices and libertarian freedom. So that the greater good includes libertarian freedom, and that before the sin is allowed, there's a testing that God does. Those are the things that I think we're going to disagree on.
But you would agree that no starving is better than some starving, right? In other words, if we have one scenario where people are starving and one scenario where nobody is starving, the second scenario is better, right? So when we talk about greater good, it seems to me like the greatest possible good in this situation is just not having a famine, or even not having a famine and also not having the brothers sold into slavery. We know that God can prevent the sin somehow, but what God decides to do is send a famine, which causes starving, and he sends Joseph before the famine so that he can save the brothers from the starving. In other words, it just seems like to me, if this is only like the greatest possible good in the scenario, it seems like God's not very creative in this particular situation, right? Whereas if this is part of a plan he's working out, like this is where he wanted to start in the first place, then obviously it's just him going through with what he wants to go through with.
So I would be circumspect in saying that God could have done it better, in that, like the butterfly effect and that sort of, like, we don't know all the outcomes and everything like that. We can see the end here because it's revealed to us in Scripture. Now, in our own lives, we don't know. That's the problem is, when God allows, me to, I don't know, stub my toe at night or whatever the case might be, I don't know what good he's going to bring out of it yet. And that's when we just have to trust him. But here in this passage, we see the greater good, so we're okay with it. So I don't agree that it would have been better that there's no famine at all. And I also would say that that's a uniqueness challenge. Like, I think that's true on both of our views, that we have to bite the bullet that there's suffering in this world.
Well, and I would agree with that, but I'll go ahead and pin this only for a moment because I want to get to the next point of this, and I don't know how much longer we have. I assume it's at least 15, but nevertheless. So the statement is, God sent me here, right? In other words, it is a statement of actions on the part of Yehovah, right? And he says it twice. Wow, I said 15, we had 8. So if I go back here to the text, it says, for God did send me before you to preserve life. And then verse 8 says, so now it was not you that sent me hither, but God. So my question then here is, if not determinism, what does it mean that God sent, meaning God actively took the action for this to happen, right? What does it mean that God sent Joseph if not by determinism?
Yeah, so the specific word is, it's not you who sent me here, right? And don't be mad at yourselves, right? So I'd say that's the exact opposite of compatibilism, because he is literally saying you didn't do it, so don't feel bad about it, right? Now, that's why I'm saying I would be very hesitant to press that language to that extreme. Rather, what I think is happening here, which happens many times in Scripture, is when God permits something and directs it towards his planned end, the Scripture will just say, God did it. And I think that's what we need to take away from this passage. What we should not take away from the passage is that the brothers shouldn't repent, that they shouldn't be angry with themselves, and that they didn't do it. The brothers did sell Joseph into slavery.
So I would agree with that entirely, as far as they are the ones who did it. They should repent, all that other kind of stuff, right? I think what the issue that I have here is, so when he says it was not you but God, it sounds to me like what he's saying is this was in God's plan. In other words, this was all the intention of God, right? But in order for that to be true, in other words, in order for Joseph to not be mistaken, it does have to ring true that God, before any of this had happened, wanted Joseph sent, right? In other words, the action, even though the brothers did accomplish it via their own free choice, I would agree with that, but the action is placed on God himself. This was the plan the whole time. How can that be true if God is not determining to get Joseph into Egypt?
Okay, that's why I went through the litany of ways that God controls things without determining things. But specifically in this case, I'd say that God used persuasion, because I mean that's literally the text has the brothers kind of debating: should we kill him? Should we sell him? And Reuben steps up in a big way and comes up with the sell him argument rather than kill him. But look, to steel man your argument. God started this, right? He sent the dream. That dream is what ticked the brothers off in the first place, because, they didn't want to bow down to Joseph. So, some of that animosity started when God revealed to the brothers. So, yeah, God did things that upset the brothers, started this whole thing. Yeah, God had it all planned out from eternity. Not a problem. But the issue is, I think this happened through God persuading the brothers, knowing what they would do, rather than a cause and effect relationship. That's the key difference. Yeah, that is, or at least one of the key differences here.
Well, and I think my issue, to me, that sounds like the same thing. And I want to give an example with another passage here real quick. So we're not done with Genesis 45, but I want to jump to Job for just a moment. So in Job chapter 1, they have the whole divine council, and God asks the Satan, what are you doing here? And, going to and fro and all that other kind of stuff. And then God says, have you considered my servant Job? Now, in this passage, we have no indication whatsoever that Satan has even thought of Job, right? He may have not, but at best, the text is entirely silent on his feelings towards Job. And God actually points him in the direction, hey, have you considered this guy? And of course, we would both agree, knowing exactly what God would do, or excuse me, what Satan would do once he was aware of Job and his righteousness. And then, of course, all the things that do happen. Now, if I somehow had complete and total foreknowledge of the way you would answer this question, and then I asked it, it wouldn't really make a whole lot of sense for me to say that I wasn't determining you to answer precisely what I knew you would answer if I asked a certain question. So given the Job situation, and given what you've already kind of said here about, these brothers, how is that not determinism? He's basically saying, I know that if X, then Y, so I'll do X, that way I can get Y. That sounds to me like cause and effect relationships, such as you're defining determinism.
So, okay. So, and CJ, I really enjoy talking with you. We
Likewise.
could go for hours and hours and hours. So the foreknowledge argument is a tough one. I'm just going to handle it very cursorily. There's a difference between God being certain and knowing an outcome versus causing the outcome. It is that second type of necessity that we talked about. It's not an absolute necessity like God exists. It's a relative necessity. Given God knows this will happen. You can syllogistically reason that out, but a syllogistic conclusion is not like cause and effect, like fire burning paper. But I'll hold my powder there. I disagree with you when you said that Satan is not considering Job. In fact, Satan is actually saying, I know Job better than you, because he's saying, if you allow me to afflict him, then he will deny you. So Satan is making a claim about what Job would freely do under alternative circumstances. And God basically says, you don't know him as well as I do. So, but Satan definitely is claiming that he knows what Job would do under different circumstances.
And I do agree. Sorry, go ahead. I thought you were done.
Right. So, but the language of the Lord gives, the Lord takes away, blessed be the name of the Lord. That's where I would say that we see in the narrative that Satan is the one that did these things, yet at the end it says that God did them. Why? Why is it that what Satan did, it says God did it? I think it's the same issue with the brothers in Genesis 45. Because God had a plan, because God used divine judo, right, and flipped their intentions against them, then it says God did it.
So I will just quickly say I do agree that God knows Job better, and he's certainly, Satan's whole deal here is definitely going to be proven wrong, right? But what I mean by Satan is not considering Job is, when you read the text, it says, I have gone back and forth, going to and fro across the earth, and he has nothing to say about Job, at least thus far, right? Now, we can assume maybe he is, maybe he isn't as far as his thought process, but the text is silent on such. And then it's God who says, have you considered my servant Job? Now, is Satan aware of Job? I think certainly, otherwise he wouldn't answer as quickly as he does. But it's that which turns his attention to Job, and God turns his attention to Job having absolute foreknowledge of what Satan would say once he turns his attention to Job. So it's kind of like he's aware that the log will tumble down if he pushes it, and then he decides to push it, right?
Hey, CJ, let me just jump in real quick. If you could quickly wrap up your thoughts in a question, and then that's the 25-minute mark. Dan will give you as much time as you need to respond, and then we'll jump into the second 25-minute round. So, CJ, go ahead, wrap up those points in a question, then we'll hand it to Dan.
Absolutely. Thank you. Well, and I think the brothers thing is the same thing, right? He sends certain things that he knows will elicit a certain response. And what my question is here is basically if we have the if X, then Y, X, therefore Y, soft determinism or hard determinism, it is still determinism. God is still knowing that if he does X, he'll get Y, and then doing X so that he can get Y. And my question then is, in what way does that not qualify as a form of divine determinism, specifically a form of divine determinism that actually leads to what we would consider to be evil actions, namely Joseph selling into slavery, and in this other case, Job getting all the terrible things that happens to him?
Okay, man, that's a tough one. So I think I'd have to parse it in probably two ways. So one is there's a potential for a modal fallacy of affirming the necessity of the consequence. So it's such that like, the two things are necessary together. So if God knows I'm going to wear a red sweater, then I'm going to wear a red sweater. That you can't say then necessarily I'm going to wear a red sweater in terms of there was a necessary process that resulted in me wearing a red sweater. I could have, there could have been a world in which God knew I wore a blue sweater or something like that. So there's that aspect that I'm worried that you potentially have made, but I don't think that's what you're doing. So my guess is that you're saying, hey, look, God sees the outcome. Now, so the way choice works is you have two alternatives, and then you make a choice, and it's narrowed down into one actual, right? And so if I'm the one that's making that choice, I'm taking the two possibilities and narrowing it into one actual. The two possibilities are now lapsed into one actual event. Now, that's in the future. Now, somehow, I don't know how, somehow God knows that future event. But I don't think it's fair for you to use that necessity against me and say, well, the outcome of your choice is an elimination of possibilities in one actual event. So I'm going to use that lack of possibilities to eliminate free will. So just because God's not foreknowledge is beforehand, I don't think you get rid of that. But if your point is simply God knows you were going to wear a red shirt, and therefore you're going to wear a red shirt, and that's a necessary logical conclusion of that syllogism, then I just have to agree with you, but I don't think that's determinism. I think determinism is absolute necessity, like God exists, or causal necessity, like fire burning paper.
Dan, thank you so much for those final words. And CJ, thanks for the final question in terms of the first 25-minute period of this 50-minute discussion. So now we're going to hand it to Dan Dan, you have 25 minutes to lead the way in terms of cross exam. So, gentlemen, again, the floor is yours.
Okay, so I'm going to share my screen. Let me see if I can. Oh, thank you. All right. So for starters, what type of dog do you have?
2 Huskies, actually.
Huskies. Nice. Yeah, I've got two dogs myself. I've got a Boston Terrier that's trying to get through the door here. But okay. So you were about to talk about the crucifixion. What did you have to? Can you give me a 30-second nutshell version of what you wanted to say about the crucifixion, because it really interests me.
Yeah, so I'll bullet point it real quick. The point number 1 was that I think Acts 2 and Acts 4 demonstrate that the crucifixion was predestined. It uses the language specifically. Number 2, that the crucifixion was an evil act done because of the wickedness of human hearts. Number 3, that those humans who had committed that, high priest, Pontius Pilate, etc., were morally responsible for what they did. And number 4, that there is a sense in which they could have not done it, but were nevertheless determined to do it, demonstrating compatibility.
Okay, so let's look at Acts 2. Let's start there. So it says in verse 23, he was delivered, so Christ was delivered according to God's determinate plan and foreknowledge. And you use lawless people to nail him to a cross and kill him. So what's the role of foreknowledge here?
I'm not 100% sure. I tend to subscribe to the ideas that James White has presented, which is namely, just to be very short with it, foreknowledge is more of a active knowledge than a passive knowledge. In other words, my knowledge of your red sweater is passive. I had nothing to do with it. My knowledge of my participating on this debate is active. I'm the sole, not the sole reason, but I'm the sole reason I participated in the debate, right? Obviously you being the reason you participated and so on and so forth. So I would say that it's that foreknowledge is an active knowledge, God knowing what he is going to do. And I think that that's informed by God's determined plan.
So would you object to the idea that God determined that Christ would die on a cross and foreknew the lawless actions of the people that nailed him to the cross?
No, I wouldn't have a issue with that. I would. My only caveat would be that I think that since God determined that Christ would be nailed to the cross, that informs our understanding of his foreknowledge. So the foreknowledge is, like I said, more of an active thing. He's causing to occur because it's part of his determined plan, not a passive thing where he's kind of figuring it out, quote unquote. I know that's not really the right language to use because we both agree that God is transcendent, but I think you know what I mean.
What does God know? So I think we agree. Did we agree that God knows that the lawless people will nail him to the cross? That's part of his foreknowledge. Okay. And so let's see. So when I say, hey, I know that I'm holding this pen, so I'm looking at the pen and my knowledge is based on this pen, right?
Knowledge is based on the pen. I guess.
Okay, so is God's knowledge of that people are going to nail Christ to the cross based on that's what they're doing in the future? Like there's people in the future that are going to nail him to the cross.
I mean, sort of. So it is in the sense that, like, when it's 2000 BC, God knows that these people will do this thing. Right. Where I would not say it's based on is, again, I think the idea of his determined plan informs the foreknowledge and lets us know that it's an active foreknowledge. So it's not so much I know that these people will exist at this time. It's more that I know I will be accomplishing the task I set to accomplish at this time. And to give an example of what I mean there by passive and active, right? So my knowledge that I'm holding this pen is active because I'm holding the pen, right? It's knowledge of what I'm doing. My knowledge that the pen is now laying on my computer is passive knowledge. It has nothing necessarily to do with me. I'm figuring it out, right? So if my knowledge is about something that I am accomplishing, it's not that I know it less than some sort of a passive knowledge, but what it means is that I am the active cause of what I know. Does that make sense?
Let's go to Acts 4 at this point. So,
Right.
because this one, okay. So let's walk through the good stuff. Okay. So you said through the Holy Spirit, by the mouth of our father David, your servant, why do the Gentiles rage and the people plot a futile thing? Okay. So the first question, what is this futile plot that the people are plotting?
I think the futile plot would be getting rid of this Messiah, right? The high priest and Pontius Pilate and all them. They think they're getting rid of Jesus when in reality, it's kind of like, when Obi-Wan dies, I will become more powerful than you could possibly imagine, right? It's kind of similar.
I'm with you. Okay, actually, we agree. We agree there. Okay, so then quoting from Psalms 2, it goes on, the kings of this earth took their stand and the rulers assembled together against the Lord and against his Messiah. For in fact, in this city, both Herod, Pontius Pilate, and the Gentiles and the people of Israel assembled together against your holy servant Jesus, whom you anointed. Okay, so we'll get to 28 in a second, but just want to make sure that we're still tracking. So the people have a plot against Jesus. They're assembled in Jerusalem. It's Herod, Pontius Pilate, the Gentiles probably being the Roman soldiers, maybe others, and the people of Israel probably is the Sanhedrin, probably the Pharisees, probably the mob, probably Judas. I don't know. So are we tracking there so far?
Yeah.
Okay. And they have a plot against God's Messiah. Now, was this plot predestined?
Yes, I believe so.
Okay. Now, that's where we're going to disagree. So, to do whatever your hand and your plan had predestined to take place, is this to do expressing the purpose or the goal or the intention of the people that are gathered? In other words, have they gathered and informed an intention about some future upcoming event?
Say that last part again.
Have the people so that you've got the Herod and Pontius Pilate and the Gentiles and the people of Israel. They're gathered together. They have a plot. They have a plan. Is this to do expressing the intention of that group? That's their purpose. They have a plan to do something. That means they haven't done it yet, but they're going to do something. They want to do something, right? So there's a future event that they want to do. Do you agree?
Yes, and I would say that to do is in reference to them. So in other words, you have the assembled together against your holy servant Jesus, and then it talks a little bit about whom you anointed, right? So it's saying that Jesus was anointed. And then when you leave that, you got the second comma right there. Obviously, there's no commas in the Greek, but I do think the translators were right to put it there. Because if there isn't a comma, it reads, whom you anointed to do whatever your hand and your plan to predestine to take place. That's talking about Jesus. If there is a comma, then the whom you anointed is somewhat broken from the rest of what's being said here. And so we can see whom you anointed, referencing Jesus, comma, to do whatever your hand and your plan had predestined to take place, which appears to me to be reading back into the gathering together of the people. So the crucifixion itself is what your hand and your plan had predestined to take place.
Okay, but how can that be? So you just said that it was the plot that was predestined. Now you're saying it's the crucifixion. So is it the plot to crucify that was predestined, or is it the crucifixion itself that was predestined?
I think it's one and the same, because the plot to predestine, the plot to crucify is how we get the crucifixion, right?
So I totally disagree. So God allowed and permitted. This is divine permission. They have a plot. They tried before to kill him, but that wasn't the time. Now is the time. Now God allows them to do what they planned because it's the predestined time for the crucifixion. But the text is talking about a future event to do. So they've already got a plot to do something in the future. What's that future thing? The thing that God predestined, which is the death and the sacrifice of Christ on the cross. It's that future thing that's predestined, not the plotting that is predestined. That's what the text is saying.
Well, so let me kind of, I think, explain why I think that would be it. Because to me, it's a distinction without a difference. And my main reason would be like, so like, if I just take this debate, I plot to be in this debate, so to speak, right? In other words, I think to do so. And now we're having the debate. Had I not thought to have this debate, we would not have the debate. Likewise, if I had thought to do something different, then something different would be at least what's on the table. Whether or not it would take place, there'd be other circumstances that would go there. But nevertheless, it is because of my scheming together with you and Donny that we have had this debate today. Without that scheming together, this debate would not be occurring, right? So it's one and the same.
So Donny is not God, but I'm going to use him as an example here. So you can scheme to be on Standing for Truth, and I can scheme to be on Standing for Truth. But if Donny doesn't allow it, it's not going to happen. And if Donny doesn't allow it to happen at a certain time, it's not going to happen, right? And so the especially the Jews had already been planning to kill Christ for a long time. They tried several times. Now is the time that God allows it. But I can back that up from the text. So the whatever your hand, this is as much as in the Greek. So God set limits on what could be done. So in other words, to do as much as your hand and your plan predestined to take place, not more than. Here, actually, I have a quote from Bengal. Where are we at? Okay, this is Bengal's commentary. They could they could do not more, though they wished it. Construe this to do with they were gathered together. For the subject of the verb to do are the enemies gathered together concerning whom the prediction has been given. So some examples of how God limited what they wanted to do. So the soldiers wanted to break Christ's legs. God didn't let them, right? The Jews wanted to change the sign and say, he said he was king of the Jews. God didn't let him. Everybody wanted to get rid of the Messiah for good. God did not let them. So he permitted some things. He prevented some things. But the only thing the text is saying that is predestined is not the plotting, is not the raging, it's not the gathering together. That's not what the text says is predestined. It says that the outcome of those things, namely the crucifixion of Jesus Christ, that's what's predestined. It's not saying that this couldn't have happened in any other way.
So there's a large deal of agreement I have with that, but I think the issue that I would have here is that you can't get the intended outcome without the plotting, right? Like if all of them were kind of standing around there thinking, well, I kind of like this guy. He's a cool dude. Why would we take him out? Well, then he's not going to be crucified, right? In other words, the plotting has to be part of what is being predestined in order for us to get the desired outcome of, and you kind of brought up the example of here with Donny. It is true that if Donny does not allow for us to use his platform, we can't have this conversation. But it's equally true that if we were not agreeing to have this conversation, Donny would not be able to host this debate. Now, if Donny had the ability to plan forward as God does in such a way that he's the creator of all these things, we're going to do whatever it is that he wills. And if he wills to have this debate, that means we're going to plot with each other to have this kind of a debate, right? So I was just going to say, so I think that's the main issue that I would see here is while I agree that God wanted to make sure this is taking place at this point and at this time and under these circumstances, without the plotting taking place, if you remove the plotting from the situation, there is no crucifixion because that's the means by which he accomplished it.
So my concern here is that if you put God's predestination behind the Gentiles raging and the people plotting futile things, which the text doesn't say, but if you just say it that way, okay, so God was predestining that too, so and predetermining that too, then I think you're breaking down the distinction between God's action and God's permission, right? Because if you're making God the source of the Gentiles' rage and that sort of thing. So just because God predestined Christ to die for sins doesn't mean that he predestined the sins that he died for. Especially all these sins, especially this. And it's specifically not saying that this happened, and rather it's God permitted these things to happen. And then Judah flips it and uses it against them, uses it to accomplish his goals, not their goals. And they wanted to get rid of Christ, and God declared him both Christ and Lord.
Well, so I think there are two different issues that I would have there. The first is I don't think, considering what we accept about God, namely the three omnis, sans the omnibenevolence, as well as his transcendence, eternality, and position as the prime mover, I don't see any difference between ordaining and allowing, which, to be fair, is not my own argument. It goes back to Calvin, but nevertheless, it sounds to me like if you actually start to explore what it means for a God of that capacity to permit things and what it means for a God of that capacity to ordain things, there's virtually no difference. The second problem I think I would have is again, I think we do have to take into account, right, that you have to have the one in order to have the other. No plotting Jews and Gentiles means no crucifixion, right? So we can't, if the crucifixion itself is predestined, it must follow that. It kind of, give an example, actually. If it is raining, it must follow that there are clouds in the sky, right? Now, if there's clouds in the sky, that doesn't necessarily mean it's raining. But in order for it to be raining, there has to be clouds in the sky because that's how rain happens, right? Likewise, in order for us to have a crucifixion, there must be plotting. That doesn't mean that if there's plotting, there will necessarily be a crucifixion.
That's right. So, okay. So I do have to push back on this whole idea that, so if God is determining the things he permits, he's basically permitting his own determination. That doesn't make sense to me. So, we looked at there is scriptural language on permission. And I really think that this is where sourcehood comes into play. And you say that you believe that we have our own sourcehood, but you're also saying, well, God is behind our sourcehood, determining our sourcehood to do these things, including sin, including rage, including the fall. So is God really permitting at that point if he's determining the things that he permits? In other words, I think that doesn't sound like permission at all.
Well, and that kind of goes back to this point I was saying, right? And again, this is something I initially had heard from, well, I did initially bring up the point myself. I was happy to know that somebody else had said it before because of the fact that, there's the old cliche about if you've thought a new thought, it's probably dumb. In other words, if the wise men before you have thought it up, then it's probably right. If it's unique to you, it's probably because it's not very smart. But at any rate, so when we talk about there being virtually no distinction between ordaining and permitting. So we have a set of qualities about God that as non-open theists, as classical theists, I would assume you're a classical theist, we would accept, right? So God is omnipotent, has the power to do anything and everything that is at least logically possible. God is omniscient, has all knowledge that exists, right? And I would, for the record, agree that he even has middle knowledge. What would be the case if this, that, and the third? God is omnipresent. I already said omniscient, which means he is actually actively, in some sense, present at all places. Eternal, he's at all places in time. Transcendent, he's not limited to our own little plane here, and is the uncaused first cause, meaning that he's ultimately the creator of all things, right? So now you have a situation. Let's take the garden, for example. God is the unmoved mover, so he's the creator of the different things here. Adam, Eve, garden, serpent, devil, the tree of knowledge of good and evil. It's all his creation, okay? So that means he has the ability not to create it or to create it otherwise, right? He is also eternal, which means he is simultaneously present before the fall, after the fall, and during the fall. He's also omnipresent, which means that he's actually, in some sense, there when the fall takes place. He's also omniscient. He knows that it will happen, that it is happening, the results of it happening after it occurs. Okay. And he's transcendent, meaning that he is not somehow limited by any of the physical things that are happening here. And then, of course, omnipotent, meaning that he has the ability to stop it or anything else for that matter. But then you have, he creates it anyway in the method that he did, leading to the conclusion that he knew, not taking any of the steps to stop it, and being physically there while it occurred. Given those things together, even if he's just sitting back afterwards, well, he's already the one who set it into motion. He already knows what happens if he sets it into motion. He's already able to stop it, and he's present while it occurs. I don't see how that's not determinism. And the only way I could see how you avoid that kind of determinism is by limiting one of those qualities. Either he didn't create it, or he wasn't there, or he didn't know, or he didn't have the power to stop it, or something along those lines.
So okay, so let's break it down then. So, does God have libertarian free will himself? In other words, could God choose Esau instead of Jacob? You know, we know that he chose Jacob, but could God have chosen Esau?
So I'm going to throw you for a little bit of a loop here. First off, could God have chosen Esau? Yes. Does God have libertarian free will? I do not think so, because God is determined by certain things, namely his own nature. For example, God cannot lie.
Yeah.
So if we mean that God has nothing determining him whatsoever, which is how you would define libertarian free will earlier, I would argue no, that God does not have libertarian free will. He has free will, but it is compatibilist with his own nature.
So let's say, I think there's two ways to look at that though. Like, one is there's a perimeter fence. So let's say God's nature limits him to only do good, but is there only one good thing that he could do? So does God's nature determine exactly what he does and nothing else? Or does God's nature set up the boundaries that only good options, but there's multiple good options that he could choose from?
Yeah, and I would agree that God does certainly have choice. And this is where I think it's important to understand the compatibilist definition of freedom. Now, of course, it'll vary in certain ways. I'm not like somehow the god of compatibilist definitions or anything like that, right? But we say that sourcehood is one potential definition, and the principle of alternative possibilities is another potential definition. That I actually would say both are in play, right? So God has the ability to do what he wills, which is something that would necessarily stem from his own nature. Obviously, he wouldn't will something against his nature. And God has alternate possibilities to do other things, right? But God is not libertarianly free in the indeterminate sense, because he does still have a nature, not a nature that's outside of himself, but a nature that is obviously from within himself, hence the definition of natures. I think we would have something similar. So it is within my nature as a human being to want to eat good food. And also I have the ability to eat bland, but nevertheless healthy food, right? But obviously, even if such were the case, well, hang on, I think I'm a little bit, I might get convoluted in that example. The point there is just to say I have both of those abilities. I have the ability to eat something well, let's just say food to make it less convoluted. I have the ability to eat something, and I have the ability to not eat something, but my nature is such that I will actually attempt to eat something at some point in time. Of course, otherwise I'll die. That's just the nature of how the human would work in that instance. Or you could use probably a less convoluted example. I'm realizing that's probably not the best example as I say it, but I think you get my idea, right? There is the ability to do what we will. There is also potential to do other things, but not outside of what our nature demands. Like, I can't not lie at any point in time. I can not lie at a given time, but all humans will lie at least at some point in their life. I can't not lust at any point in time. I can not lust at a given time, but all people will lust at least at some point in time, and so on and so forth.
So this is Exodus 9:15. God is talking.
1 minute, gentlemen.
God is talking. He says, "By now I could have stretched out my hand and struck you and your people with a plague." Right. So God didn't actually do that yet, but he could have. So do you agree that God was able to decree otherwise than he decreed. So God's nature didn't necessitate. He decreed what he did, right? He could have
Yes,
decreed.
absolutely.
Okay. So in that case, then I think we're past the sense of absolute necessity. And so now we're down to the question of causal necessity. Do you think that what we do is a matter of cause and effect, given the causes, is what we do causally necessary, like fire burning paper?
So this is a difficult question to answer, only because the short answer is yes. But I don't. So I got to get a little philosophical in order to say it, right? So we're both doing this debate, right?
Yeah.
Now, hypothetically, in a world where CJ Cox is born in 16th century Africa, right? And I'm born to a tribe that does not have access to theological texts and philosophical texts and stuff like that. And we don't have computers, obviously, because it's the 16th century and all this kind of stuff. It is entirely possible, in fact, incredibly likely, that the things that I wish to do, the nature I possess, would be entirely different, right? In other words, I am here doing this debate because of a succession of things that I had no control over, namely where I was born, when I was born, what I had access to, the different people surrounding me. You know what I mean?
I apologize to barge in, but just the last question, because I know we're out of time. How do you avoid the contradiction that we can and cannot do otherwise? Given the causal forces, can we do otherwise than what we're being causally determined to do?
I think we are physically and mentally capable of doing otherwise, but that nevertheless we will do that which has been determined for us. So I guess a way you could put it is like, is it possible for a snowball to stop falling down the hill? It is physically capable of doing so, right? But it will nevertheless fall down the hill. Now, why could it be physically capable? Something could stop it. There could be like a little divot in the snow such that it would, be held or something like that. But the likelihood is it will continue to fall down the path, right?
Yeah. It needs another context. In its context, it can't stop itself, but in another context, it could. In other words, in reality, it can't.
Well, and yes, that is certainly true. So it's like physically capable, mentally capable, ultimately capable. Yes, no. Right. And I think that is actually something that, believe it or not, Molinism has kind of helped me understand, only because you have a similar thing kind of going on Molinism, right? Where it's like there's all these different middle ground sort of things, but God has decided to actualize a certain universe where this, that, and the third would occur. Whatever this, that, and the third happens to be is obviously up to whatever God decides to actualize. And in that situation, he's actualizing a certain universe where ultimately everything is set, right? To quote William Lane Craig on it, he can look through the corridors of time, as he says, and which, to be fair, William Lane Craig is only speaking this kind of language to better explain himself, right? I know he doesn't actually believe God is looking through the corridors of time or anything like that, but nevertheless, he's saying that he's looking through here and he's saying, okay, that's happening. That's not what I want. So I'll instead go with this situation, and actualizing that situation leads to a certain path. But once that world has been actualized in an ultimate sense, the creature does not have the ability to do otherwise, because otherwise that would mean a different world was actualized, right? And I think William Lane Craig, though he's speaking from a Molinistic perspective, he's exactly right there. We have physical and mental capacity to do things, but if we were going to do a different thing, that would mean there was a different path that was actualized than the one that we currently are on. Since this is the one we are on, ultimately, we are going to do the decisions that we are going to enact the certain things that are determined on this path that we're set.
So, gentlemen, I'm going to have to jump in here. We're a couple minutes over on this round. I got to say, this conversation is so good that the entire 50-minute cross exam has flown by. Excellent discussion. You both have given me an incredibly easy job to moderate tonight. So it's always nice to have a debate like that. You both were professional, civil, and sophisticated and comprehensive. I think we had a good amount of time on each of these important points. So CJ, Dan, excellent job during the cross exam. We've got closing statements, though. We've got 5 minutes in terms of concluding statements. CJ, you were the affirmative today. You started with your opening statement. So we're going to give you the first 5 minutes. And so whenever you're ready, go ahead.
Do you mind if I just very briefly use the restroom before I do?
You said the restroom?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, go ahead. And we're at the 2-hour mark, so no worries. So take your time. I'll go over a few announcements. I just did a formal debate 2 nights ago, right here. Me and Grayson, 3.5 hours. So in 3.5 hours, there's at least one washroom break there, of course. So the great ancestry debate: does genetics support universal or common ancestry? If you guys haven't yet seen that debate, please do check it out. It was a ton of fun. So debates we got coming up tomorrow night. We've got Is Oneness Biblical? That is between Kelly Powers and John Barton. And so both of them have been here before. John Barton was here months ago, debated Matt Slick. And Kelly Powers has had a number of debates as well. So that should be a fun debate, should be a thorough debate. And then we have lots of hype for this debate. So I'm looking forward to this one. Soteriology. Do all believers persevere? So this is your classic lordship versus free grace debate. Again, 2 very knowledgeable and professional individuals here. I should add scholarly. So Turretin Fan and Charles Jennings, they're going to be duking it out here on Saturday. I'm pumped for this debate. And again, if you're not yet subscribed, I did just book 2 big debates for January. So we're going to be kickstarting the year the right way. So we've got an informal debate here. Dr. Stephen Boyce and Will Kinney. So they both have done a ton of study on this subject. And so just make sure you're here for this one, Bible translation discussion. I'll be moderating it and guiding it along, and we're going to make sure to hit some important points. And then the same week, we've got the great rapture debate. So Pastor Matt first, Pastor Daniel Aldridge. And looks like CJ is back. So hope you're refreshed. Good to go, CJ. And whenever you're ready, my good man, you got your 5-minute closing statement. Go ahead.
Thank you very much. So I'll start off by thanking everybody again. Appreciate the audience for watching this here today. Appreciate Donny for setting this up. And I appreciate Brother Dan for an incredibly cordial and thought-provoking conversation. I'm certainly up to do it again if you ever want to. And also you have an invitation to my channel anytime you'd like to come. I think we could have some more pretty solid conversations. I also want to say, as I do, Proverbs 27 verse 2 says, let someone else praise you and not your own mouth, an outsider and not your own lips. So those of you who thought that I did a good job here today, if I strengthened your belief in determinism, or if I caused you to come more to the side of determinism, being somebody who started this on the other side, please do let me know. And I appreciate any of the criticisms that you guys have there. The same chapter in verse 17 says, as iron sharpens iron, so one person sharpens another. So if you thought that I did a poor job in this conversation, whether you be somebody who was on my side and left, or somebody who was on the other side and just thought that it wasn't particularly great, also please do let me know. We always want to do it in the 1 Peter 3:15 spirit, with gentleness and respect. But nevertheless, I covet your guys' criticisms, both good and bad. And I hope that we are edifying the body and glorifying the Lord here today. I want to go ahead and draw together the strings here of this debate and see if we can come to some solid conclusions. And I think indeed we are able to do so today. So the first thing is, I think it was very firmly, I won't say very firmly, but I think we were able to establish here that at least some actions in the Bible are determined, and that these determined actions are determined through the means of human free will. There were 2 in particular that were discussed here today. The first was the selling of Joseph into slavery, which I believe was determined of God. God wanted to have Joseph in Egypt so that he could have Joseph freeing the 12 saving the 12 tribes from the famine that he sent. And the second one was the crucifixion. I think that God wanted the people in that place at that time with those motivations, such that Jesus Christ would end up being crucified, such that he could raise from the dead, such that we could then confess him as Lord and recognize his atonement for our own sins. And I think that the reason that that's important is because while obviously I believe all things are determined, as I said earlier, this kind of a what would you say, compromise position, I guess, is not something that goes both ways, right? In other words, if I can find one situation where God has determined actions via human free will, then compatibilism is at least in some cases true, especially if we can add the concept of moral determinism there, right? Or of moral responsibility there. But if on the flip side, you can have you have only one option there, it does not follow that libertarian free will is true, right? In other words, if these people can truly said to be free, but their actions were also determined, that demonstrates determinism is in fact biblical. And I think we have a couple other situations there that were read, though not clearly addressed, in Esau being disapproved of, in what's the other example I gave there? Isaiah 10, and other different situations that we could bring there as well. I also want to point out that, and I don't mean this in a insulting way or anything like that, but precisely as Romans 9 predicted, we received Romans 9 objections. Okay, now that's exactly what we should expect, given the fact that Romans 9 is anticipating these objections to what is being said by Paul. Nevertheless, though, the question of why does God find fault with anybody who can resist his will is one of the questions that was not only brought up in this conversation, but is brought up in every single Calvinist conversation. And the other question of, is God then the author of evil, was also brought up in this conversation, as it is indeed brought up in all these Calvinist conversations. I would suggest to you guys, if we are exegeting Romans 9 and passages like it, and we are getting the objections which Paul anticipates we will get given the answers he has given, that should be a hint to us that we are exegeting this in the right way. And if we are not getting those objections, which the non-Calvinist will not receive, then it should cue us into the fact that we are not interpreting the text the way that Paul had initially wanted it. Now, with that being said, I thought this was an excellent conversation. I think Dan was an excellent interlocutor, and I very much appreciated the conversation that we had here today. Again, I want to say I do covet your guys' criticisms, and I very much appreciate having this conversation with you guys. I'll yield the rest of my time, and shalom to you all.
Thank you very much there, CJ Cox, for the 5-minute concluding statement. Now we're going to hand it to Dan. Dan, whenever you're ready, brother, you got 5 minutes. Go ahead.
Sure. And thanks again to Donny and CJ, and this has been great. So Romans 9, just touching on that real briefly. So in Romans 9:18, he shows mercy on whom he wants, and he hardened those whom he wants. So mercy presupposes sin. You can't have mercy on somebody unless they're a sinner. The same is true of hardening. The hardening, when God hardens a heart, it's a judicial punishment for previous sins. That's talked about in Romans 1, when the people are turned over a reprobate mind. It's definitely the case with Pharaoh. Pharaoh was commanding bricks without straw and denying releasing the Israelites and saying, God, who are you, beforehand, and then God punishes them for those sins. That's the issue, right? So when it comes to why does he yet find fault for who has resisted his will? Yes, God, as a punishment for sin, will harden people and still hold them accountable. That is true, but there's still a tracing issue of the previous state when, before they were hardened, they chose evil actions, and they're held accountable for that. You can see the same thing as it goes on in terms of vessels of wrath. God's enduring them with patience, the vessels of wrath fitted for destruction in Romans 9:22. It's wrath. What is God mad about if it's not sin? And he's fitting them, but he's waiting patiently, like he did with Pharaoh. He didn't kill Pharaoh right away. He did the 10 plagues to get his name out, to declare his glory, but he's patient with them. And so we can see that this Hardening is a punishment for previous sins. Now, in terms of the overall debate, it all is about definitions, right? So is theistic determinism biblical? What exactly do we mean by determinism? So I think CJ and I were on the same page in terms of it's not an absolute necessity, like God exists, right? In every possible world, God exists. And so I think we agree there. So where the point of contention came down to, and fortunately we didn't get to the very, very end, was causal determinism. Now, this idea of the snowball, so a snowball rolling down the hill, it does not have the ability not to roll down the hill. I'm sorry, it just doesn't. And the sense in which it does is not in this world, not on this planet, but in some other world. Now, that's where I push back. The Bible says we have choices and make choices. Choices are real. They're not hypothetical. They're not in some alternative world where we have this ability to do otherwise. No, we have it here. That's why Christ told Peter, why you couldn't you have stayed awake another hour? Just that rhetorical question, saying that he did have that ability to stay awake another hour. That was real in this planet, not in some hypothetical. People use hypotheticals to try to explain these things all the time. Well, he could have if he wanted to, but he didn't want to. And why didn't he want to? It was impossible for him to want to, because God decreed for him not to want to, right? So it's not in some impossible hypothetical where we have an ability to do otherwise. No, here in this world, we really have the ability to do otherwise. That's what biblical choice comes down to. That's why I'm not a determinist, because I'm faithful to the text. Yes, it is more interesting when you get into the question of moral responsibility, but there's enough motivation alone in being faithful to the biblical language of the ability to do otherwise, God enabling us not to give into temptations, God testing us, God deepening his relationship with us when he's testing us to see whether we'll walk in his laws or not. These are the reasons why we should realize that determinism is just simply the contradiction, that we can and cannot do otherwise, that the snowball has both a sufficient cause to roll down the hill, such that it has to roll down the hill, it's necessary for it to, and it can do otherwise. It can't. Right, so that's a contradiction, that there's both a sufficient and an insufficient condition for that snowball to roll down the hill, or a sufficient and an insufficient cause for our actions. That's a contradiction. And to say that God can't control things in that way, if determinism is a contradiction, that's no limitation on God's power to say that God can't do a contradiction, right? But we've seen that God can control things by permission, by persuasion, by all these different things. We went through it. So yes, God has plans. Yes, God is sovereign. Yes, God is in control. And I really come down to the idea of the permission of the cross, which we saw. We went piece by piece, step by step, that the text does not say that God predestined for the people to rage, for the people to plot. No, he allowed their plot to go forward at that time because he predestined the death of the son for sins, not that he predestined all the sins that his son died for. So, and when we looked at Joseph, again, in the very account, there's an amount of persuasion. And if you press the text to
20 seconds.
So yes, the text says the brothers didn't do it, but there has to be a sense in which they did do it, because the rest of the scriptures say that, and we can't just let the scriptures contradict each other, right? So we have to reconcile them. And the way I see it is God permitted the brothers to sin and brought good out of it. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you again to Donny and CJ for our wonderful discussion and evening.
Thank you very much, Dan, and my pleasure. I always like to thank the debaters for being so generous with your time, because if you guys weren't so generous with your time, we wouldn't have all these awesome debates. So excellent job, very engaging debate, and very professional. So I appreciate it. So with that, we're jumping into the audience Q&A. I've got a ton of questions here, Dan and CJ. And Dan, since this is your first time here on the channel, typically what we do is whoever the question's for, we allow them to get the last word. So let's say the question's for CJ. CJ, you respond. Dan, you can, have a response as well. If there's anything CJ says, you can object to that kind of thing. And then CJ would give you the last word. So, okay, here we go. First question that has come in all the way in the opening statement. So we got a healthy amount of questions. I'm going to start the timer right now for it. And okay, so first question is for your guests. So since we have two guests, I'm not sure which one specifically, but we'll work through it together. So didn't God raise up the king of Babylon and other kings to bring punishment on Israel and then to restore Israel back into the promised land? I think it's a question for you, Dan. Didn't God raise up the... So if so, we can start with you if you'd like.
Yes, he absolutely has a plan for all those things. The question, I think, is, is every action determined? And there I would say no, but God can control things without using determinism, like using permission and persuasion and opposition and many, many different ways to control things without using determinism. But the answer to this question is yes.
I appreciate it, Dan. And Centurion 737, thanks for the question. CJ, over to you.
Absolutely. So I would also say yes. I would disagree, though, that it doesn't entail determinism. I think, and we can use the example of the Pharaoh because it's one that's explicitly referenced in Scripture. I think when God says, I raised you up for this purpose, the implication there is if it wasn't for God's plan to perform these miracles in the sight of Pharaoh, then Pharaoh would not, in fact, be risen up. The reason that Pharaoh is, in fact, Pharaoh at that point in time is so God can harden his heart and so he can work the miracles through Moses against the Egyptian people. It seems to me like that is a clear indication of determinism, and I would argue a clear indication of compatibilism also. Why? Because it is said that Pharaoh hardened his own heart. It's said that Pharaoh hardened his own heart and that God did and will and in the past already has hardened his heart. In my opinion, it's because these two things are not contradictory. God hardens his heart by way of his own free choice. He rose him up there knowing that he was going to be that person. And I would argue that his reason for existing is, in fact, to be that person, as well as whatever else God decided to accomplish in his life.
I appreciate the response there, CJ. Dan, we'll give you the last word. Go ahead.
Sure. So the hardening of hearts presupposes that the heart was previously softer. And it's at those times when it's softer, when people make the wrong choices on their own, then God punishes those choices. But we also see in the text, and I read this earlier, but in Exodus 3:19, however, I know that the king of Egypt will not let you go unless he is forced by a strong hand. So I will stretch out my hand and strike Egypt with all the miracles that I will perform in it. Part of the reason that God brought the plagues was because he knew that Pharaoh wouldn't freely let the people go.
Appreciate it, Dan. And again, thanks to Centurion for the question. So next question comes in from Kevin's Biblical Discussions. Kevin, appreciate it. So questions for CJ. If God has determined sin, how is he holy? Also, if he did determine sin, wouldn't sin be an extension of the character of God?
Good questions. So the first question is, if God has determined sin, how is he holy? There is a very long way to answer this, but I'll try and bullet point it. The first is that God is expressing his attributes through creation, right? So, for example, God is a being who's deserving of worship. He expresses that attribute by creating worshipers. God is a redeemer. He is expressing that attribute by creating somebody who needs to be redeemed. God is a judge. He is expressing that attribute by creating somebody who it is necessary to judge, so on and so forth. The second answer is that God is accomplishing the things he has determined by way of free human choice. In other words, it's not like the Pharaoh did not have any sort of part in his enslaving of the Jews, right? Pharaoh, by his own will, wanted to enslave the Jews, and he had the ability to do something else, but nevertheless, he decided to enslave those Jews because that's what he really wanted to do. Is it true that God has determined that? Yes, but is it true that God has determined that by way of the free choices of Pharaoh himself? That is exactly correct. The other thing here, too, is we just got to recognize, as much as we want to get God off of this hook, God doesn't want off of this hook. God says, as plainly as anything can be said, is there evil in the city and the Lord has not done it? God says that he is the creator of both good and evil in Isaiah 45:7. So on and so forth, all these other times. We really want God off of this hook. The thing is, God doesn't want to be off this hook. He's actually telling you the opposite. No, I did it. Okay, it was me. The last thing I would say here to the question is it, if he did determine it, would sin be an extension of the character of God? I do not think that that would necessarily follow any more than it would, follow that it did God determine for us to, make up pink unicorns. Does that mean pink unicorns are reflective of the character of God? I don't think so. It's just something that God has actually decided to be part of his story. And I'll leave it there because I don't want to take too much time.
So,
okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
Dan, go ahead.
So it's an interesting question, Kevin. It makes me think. I mean, so let's say, for example, if God needs to have sin in order to express his wrath on sin, that does seem to me and it seems very important that God expresses attributes. So it seems to me it's saying that part of God's expression of his attributes is dependent on sin. So I worry about that approach. I think that you could in some way say that sin is at least necessary for an extension of God's character. And that is highly concerning. So look, the way I say this like this, like you got sin over here and you've got God over here. In between them, I think there has to be libertarian free will. If you don't have libertarian free will at all, you can't have libertarian free will between God and sin. And that is concerning.
Thank you very much, Dan. CJ, this question was for you, so you get the last word this time. Go ahead.
Yeah, well, I would say, while I can appreciate the concern, it is simply the case. God cannot express his attribute as judge without something to judge. He cannot express his attribute of redeemer if there is nothing to redeem. God can't be merciful if there's nobody undeserving of mercy for him to give grace to, right? And so on and so forth. So if God truly wished to express his attributes, it's just a necessity that these things would come about. And while I understand why that might be concerning, I think it is something that we should definitely wrestle with.
Thank you, CJ, for that final word. Next question comes in from Irresistible Truth. And Irresistible Truth has a question for Dan. If I'm not mistaken, I believe this individual, Dan, said earlier that you're the nicest Arminian. So it looks like there was a compliment for it. So he's asking, if God permits you to sin in the moment you sin, did he permit the prior moment and the prior moment and the prior moment regressing back to your initial existence?
I mean, I think by the way, hey, Derek. I think the answer is yes, because God can prevent anything. It didn't even have to exist in the first place. Now, permission is not a cause. So there has to be already an initial inclination for God to permit something, right? Otherwise, there's nothing to permit. In other words, like, hey, Derek, I hereby permit you to become an Arminian. No, it doesn't work that way. I can't just, cause you to do something by permission, right? That doesn't work that way. The way I put it is this, like, okay, so let's say you're at a fork in the road, left or right. Can God permit you to go left, and then can God permit you to go right? Because at that point, what we're using the word permission, but we're talking about action. God determining you to go left, God determining you to go right. And that's what I'm afraid has happened here in this debate, is that the distinction between God permitting something and God doing something has been collapsed.
Appreciate it, Dan. CJ, over to you.
I think this is an excellent question, because what it's trying to get at is the fact that your individual decisions don't exist in a vacuum, right? So if God is permitting X and the reason you did X is Y, and God also permitted Y, you know what I mean? You just have basically this turtles all the way down kind of situation where it seems like God is not only permitting the causes, but he's also permitting the effects. And if he's permitting the causes, it kind of seems like he's causing the things to take place, especially if some of the causes are like for example, if I stole from somebody because there was a famine and I was starving, well, we know for a fact that the famine, I don't think anybody disagrees that the famine is God's determination, right? In other words, we all agree that natural evil, quote unquote, calamity, as people would call it, is certainly the determination of God, right? And if that's the reason I decided to do that, and if I had not had that famine, I wouldn't have done the thing that I actually did, which indeed was a sin, then in what way are we saying that God has not somehow determined that to take place? Not that he's the author of sin. I freely chose to do it. I could have not done so, but he knew I was going to do so, and he sent the famine anyway, right? I think it's better to just bite the bullet and say, God has ordained all things that have come to pass so that his holy and divine purposes could be met. And I think when we're all back here looking at what those purposes are, there's not a single one of us who's going to be like, well, God, this, that, and the third, therefore, I don't think you're actually being quite holy. I think it'll be made manifest before us.
Thank you, CJ. Dan, you get the last word. Go ahead.
So if God permits a sin, so there was already an inclination to sin, and God knew it was going to happen. God could have stopped it, but he chose not to stop it. If there's a previous permission before that, right? Again, there's another previous inclination for whatever that previous thing was, and God could have stopped it, and he chose not to stop it. So yeah, God is in control, but he is using permission. But there is a sense in which there's a sourcehood coming from the people rather than from God. But if you put God at the beginning of it, saying God determined that inclination to begin with to sin, then I think it ultimately undermines permission, because then God is just permitting what he already determined.
Okay, thank you so much, Dan. Next one comes in from Alyosha. Alyosha, thank you so much for the questions, several questions, comments, and super chat. So appreciate the support. So Alyosha has a question here, but I think it's going to basically be for the both of you. So we'll get you both of your views here. So Alyosha says, if you're a parent on your fourth child and you tell him/her, I'm guessing, not to touch the trash can, and given the nature of the child, what's about to happen, where is the locus of culpability? Do you gentlemen have any thoughts on this at all?
I think what the question is trying to get at is and correct me if I'm wrong, Alyosha, but if you know that the child will do A, but you command them not to do A, and they do A anyways, are you somehow culpable? I think the answer to that question is certainly no. However, if you, let's say, for example, you know for a fact that your child will eat the cookie if you give it to them, and then you give the child the cookie and say, don't eat it, are you culpable then? Well, in the sense that the child is still the one disobeying, but in the sense that you're certainly the primary cause of what happened, absolutely. There's no doubt about that. You knew what was going to happen, and especially if you had absolute knowledge of what was going to happen, but you decided to give the cookie anyways, right? Maybe you have certain reasons for doing that. I don't have any doubts about that. Maybe you're trying to teach self-control or what have you. I don't know. But nevertheless, the point is you decided to give the cookie, right? And this is one of the big reasons why I talk about ordaining and permitting are not different from God's point of view, because he's the one who created the situations and scenarios that allow us to do X, Y, and Z, as well as not stopping it, as well as having complete and total knowledge of what would have happened and being present at the time that it did happen. It seems to me like there's virtually no difference in that instance between an ordination and a cause, and permission. And in both instances, I would say that God is certainly the primary cause of all things.
Go ahead, Dan.
So I think the question is so the child is culpable. So the question, I think, is the parent also culpable? And the way I would put it is this: so there's a difference between a sting operation and an entrapment in law enforcement, right? So a sting operation is you set up a place where a drug deal can go down, but you have law enforcement officers come in and just arrest the person right on the spot. But you put the opportunity there, but then it was up to that person and then they chose. But entrapment is the exact opposite, where you're inducing the person to commit the crime. That's illegal, and law enforcement officers aren't allowed to entrap you, right? So if, as a parent, if your plan is to get the child to touch the trash can, and let's say that touching the trash can is something morally wrong, and instead of touch the trash can, steal something or whatever the case. So if your plan is to induce your child to do something wrong, then you also bear culpability. But I think in that case, both the child and the parent would be morally culpable.
Thank you, Dan. And here's another one from Alyosha. This one's specifically for you, CJ. It is a $25 super chat, so I appreciate it. So I'll get it up on screen. And CJ will allow you to respond. Looks like he's coming at you. So I think he's responding to something from the cross exam. So he says, if you shoot the intent issue through proverbially dealing with a 3-year-old with the intent of allowing them to learn, the entire process of learning would appear to the child as coming from without. Any thoughts on that or response, CJ?
Well, if I understand what's being said, I think that they're saying the intent here, in God intending for, and I'm going to assume this is related to Joseph, God intending for good in Genesis 15:20 is for the purpose of teaching. And in this case, I would assume he's probably saying teaching Joseph and the brothers. I don't have any issue necessarily with that. I think that most theodicies actually work very well under Calvinism, even though they're not the necessary ultimate reason, right? And then the ultimate theodicy, you might say. I would just say that that's still determining, right? In other words, if you're determining X for a specific result, that's fine, but you are still determining X. You could use the example of if I tell my child, we're not going to go to ice cream today until you clean up your room or something like that, right? And that sort of threat there is, meant to convince them to clean their room or something like that. That's perfectly fine, I guess, but I don't see how that would take away from the intention of me, right? I hope I explained that right. I think I kind of messed that up a little bit. But anyways, I think you guys get the idea. If not, ask for clarification.
Thank you very much, CJ. Dan, anything you'd like to add to either the comment or anything that CJ said?
So if the intention is to allow the child to learn, but I see the intention of allowing them to learn is in asterisk. So, okay, we're not God, right? We can't have this consequentialist reason of, the end justifies the means, or, that sort of thing. So if the intention is to let the child or have the child do something evil and then bring some greater good out of that, no, we just obey God's commands, and that has to start from the get-go. It's not like the outcome just justifies the whole process. So if that action is something that's sinful, then no, that doesn't sound, and we can't guarantee that we're going to bring some greater good out of it. So no, that line of thinking is quite uncomfortable to me. I would want to hear more, Alyosha, but I worry about this end justifies the means sort of thing that's coming out through here.
Thank you very much, Dan. CJ, you get the quick final word.
Well, I'd say briefly, I guess, consequentialism and ends justifying the means and stuff like that, I don't think is necessarily problematic. In fact, I would argue, I guess, if morality truly is objective, values in numbers are objective. 1 is 1 and not 3. And because 1 is 1 and not 3, you can say definitively that 3 is of greater value than 1. Likewise, I think because morality is objective and morals have certain values, you can say that one value is of greater value than another, and therefore consequentialism can be justified via an objective moral framework. But nevertheless, that's not necessarily so much on Alyosha's comment as much as it is Dan's, but moving on.
Thank you very much, CJ. Next question comes in from Point of Defense with John Crawford. John, thanks so much for the question. And he's got a question for CJ. If God decrees evil, then why is man held accountable for it?
That is an excellent question. And it just so happens to be exactly what Paul preempted in Romans 9, chapter 19, when he said, "Thou wilt say unto me, why doth he yet find fault? For who hath resisted his will?" So that's the first thing you need to notice. You're asking this question, right? But this question is exactly what Paul expects you to ask if you follow his argument in Romans 9, which leads me to believe that I'm following his argument in Romans 9 and that the opposition is not. Now, with that being said, why is man still held accountable for it? Because man is freely choosing to do what they want to do, in so much as that they have the physical and mental capacity to do otherwise, meaning alternate possibilities are a thing, and also in so much as that they are doing what they want to do, doing what they will, sourcehood, in other words. And that is why man is held morally accountable. And the last thing I would say is this. I know a lot of people say, okay, but how does that work with, how does compatibilism work logically? I think that it does work logically, and I think I can explain how it works logically. However, I find it somewhat disingenuous, and I don't mean this in an insulting way, but I find it somewhat disingenuous of people who will say, I believe God is both three and one, or Jesus was both fully God and fully man. And these things sound contradictory to the human mind, but then when we say the choice is both free and determined, all of a sudden you have to make perfect logical sense of it, or it can't be accepted. That seems disingenuous to me. So that would be kind of my short answer there. And yeah, good. Go ahead and take the floor.
CJ, thank you. And Dan, we're going to hand it over to you. Go ahead.
Yeah, so that's exactly why in my opening statement I pressed the point about Isaiah 5:3-4, but specifically God invites us to judge him, right? He says, judge between me and my vineyard, right? What more could I have done for my vineyard that I haven't done for it? So I don't think that we can appeal to mystery when it comes to moral responsibility. As far as Pharaoh and the hardening of his hearts, I mean, I've said it a couple times now, but I think that Pharaoh freely sinned before his heart was hardened, when his heart was softer, and then God punished him for it. And that's what Paul's talking about here. And it's definitely implied when in verse 18 it says he shows mercy on whom he wants. You can't have mercy on anyone other than a sinner, right? And he hardens whom he wants. So God can either have mercy on somebody or harden them. But in both cases, that person is a sinner, and they're a sinner first, and then God either has mercy on them or he hardens them. And then so it's that preceding tracing condition that is important. And Paul himself brings that out when he says that God is having patience with the objects of wrath, right? They're objects of wrath. He's angry at them because of their sins, but he's being patient with them, right? That's that tracing condition that I was talking about earlier. So, unfortunately, I would just press CJ and just say, hey, look, the subjector is not an Arminian; it is a Jew.
Thank you, Dan. Question was for you, CJ. Quick final word.
Yeah, so I would agree, of course, that it's the Jewish people there. However, I think it would be important to note that the Jewish people at the time did have a what would be closer to an Arminian view than a Calvinist view, although not all of them. There's different sects of Judaism, right? But the other thing, and I would just stress this again, both of the expected objections to Romans 9, I get every single time I exegete Romans 9, without exception. And I would be willing to bet that my non-Calvinist brethren have never even received it once in their entire lives. And I think that's an important thing for us to point out, because if the way I'm exegeting is leading people to conclude exactly what Paul expects them to conclude, that should be an immediate flag. Hey, the Calvinist is actually exegeting this correctly. And if on the flip side, you're never getting that objection at all, that should be another immediate flag to say, hey, you're not exegeting this correctly. And I say that, of course, with respect.
Okay, thank you, CJ. And great questions so far. Great responses from the both of you. This one's more so for fun, but I do want to thank Truth. WSYF, $20 super chat. Wow, much appreciated. You guys are the life and blood of this channel, and our awesome support system and audience is exactly why we can do this full time. So Truth says, did God determine me to send a super chat? So thanks for all you do, Donny. God bless. God bless you as well. Much appreciated. Okay, so next question. Well, it looks like Alyosha has a follow-up in the form of a super chat, so we will get it up here. CJ, and this is the CJ versus Alyosha Q&A debate. So Alyosha is saying, I'm guessing this is in response to possibly something you said in your previous response to his question. So in that it's inevitable except to place the child in a real world situation where they can't come to knowledge in any other way, that they would never come to adulthood without being tested. CJ, if you had a response, go ahead.
Let me see. And that it's inevitable to place the child in a real world situation where they can't come to knowledge in any other way, that they would never come to adulthood without being tested. I might just be being dumb, to be honest, but I don't think I get what the point is. Perhaps this is just a clarification and not a question, in which case I think I do get what the point is. But if it is a question, then I think I'm missing it.
Alyosha, if you are in the chat and you wanted to clarify anything, or I know sometimes when it's just comments rather than a strict question, as a debater myself, sometimes it's hard to kind of parse it out. But Dan, unless you had any thoughts, we can move on.
Yeah, so I guess I like the line of thinking, right? So obviously you've got to kind of throw the kids in the deep end at some point. You know, that's certainly true. And I think God does the same with us. He tests us to see whether he'll walk in his ways or not, as it says in Exodus 16:4, and that he also doesn't just throw us in the deep end. He gives us the grace that we need. And we see that in 1 Corinthians 10:13. No temptation has overtaken us such that is common to man, but God will, with those temptations, provide a way of escape that you will be able to bear it. So God does test us, but he doesn't just leave us on his own. He helps us. And that's what I want to be as a father to my kids as well.
Thank you very much, Dan. Is there a quick final word you wanted, CJ? Since I guess it was
No, I think we couldn't move on there.
Okay. Chris Lucas, the Protestant View Live. Good to have you, Chris. And thanks for your super chat and questions. So short and sweet question for CJ. If God determines everything, why test people?
You know what's actually very interesting about this argument is that this argument goes back 2,300 years to before Christ had ever shown up. It's known as the idol argument. The long and short, Aristotle is the first person we know who said it. But obviously somebody probably said it before him. But nevertheless, the idol argument is, if X is determined, why do Y? And the specific example that's usually given is like, if you are determined to get better, why go to the doctor? Because it doesn't matter if you go to the doctor, you're determined to get better. And the answer that was given, and it was given first by the Stoics, and then this argument ended up happening again amongst the church, Eusebius and Origen, although not directly because Eusebius is 100 years after Origen, but nevertheless, the answer was, it is entirely possible that X is determined through the mechanism that is Y, or in other words, that these things are co-fated with each other. So if God determines everything, it's entirely possible that what God has determined will take place through the testing, which God has also determined. In other words, the testing is co-fated, you could say, right? Another very quick way you could think about this is God has determined the ends as well as the means, or to go back to the doctor example, God has determined you will get better because he has determined you will go to a doctor who has the answers.
Thank you very much, CJ. Dan, yeah, over to you. The floor is yours.
Yeah, I'm just worried that's a contradiction, that you can and cannot pass the test. You can and you are and are not enabled to avoid the sin.
Thank you very much, Dan. Quick final word there, CJ.
Well, again, I would say, I do understand the issue there. But remember, we accept things that have a certain level of mystery to them all the time. That doesn't mean they can't be explained. The hypostatic union, for example, can be explained. God is 100% man, 100% God. And we can explain that. But it sounds at first like it's logically contradictory. Likewise, I freely admit that it sounds at first like we're free in one sense and determined in another could be logically contradictory. But when we start to get down to the nitty-gritty, I think we find that it's not.
CJ, appreciate it. Patrick Anton Giovanni says this truly was an excellent, respectful debate. Excellent speaking, and amen. Great job to the both of you. Appreciate you both making for an epic debate. It's such an important topic. It's a technical topic, but you guys engaged it really in the perfect way. So, okay, here we go. Jamie Russell, Christian Middle Earth, $5 super chat. Thanks, Jamie. And okay, question I'm going to assume is for CJ, but we'll go through it together. Did Jesus condemn himself in Matthew 18:6? If anyone caused one of these little ones to stumble, CJ, go ahead.
No, I don't think he did. Because again, while I do think that all things are determined, I think that we also have genuine free will such that we have the possibility to do other things. We just simply won't. And also that we do precisely what we will to do. I think both sourcehood and the principle of alternative possibilities are in play in real life, and that also all things are determined in both a divine deterministic sense and a causally deterministic sense. I don't think these things are contradictory, and I think that would, I guess, suffices as the whole answer. But nevertheless, no, I don't think he's condemning himself. And I don't think that when the non-Calvinist Christian is on the other side of eternity, because this is an inside issue, and I don't expect anybody to be damned because of it, I don't think that they're going to be thinking the same either. And I don't think that the one who's damned is going to be thinking the same either, for the record.
Okay, CJ, thanks so much. Dan, floor is yours.
Yeah, I mean, when it comes to causal determinism, that is concerning. Now, I suppose to steelman rather than straw man the position, I suspect the word is scandalon, and God doesn't tempt, but I still think if everything is causally determined by God's decree, that I can't square that circle.
Okay, Dan, much appreciated. CJ, quick final word.
Just a fun one, actually. So I'm going to draw it here on my hand, how you might square a circle. This is both a square, and it's not really a circle. It's actually terribly drawn. But nevertheless, you can see how, because of additional information, it can be both a square and a circle.
Interesting.
All right, appreciate it, CJ. And I got to say, time has really flown by on this one. I mean it, almost at the 3-hour mark. So we could probably do questions for another 2-3 hours. We got to wrap it up somewhere. The 25 minutes flew by. We're way over that. So, I'm finding it almost impossible. We get so many questions from the audience. I know everybody says that, but I say it and I mean, I think we got the best audience here, and we get so many questions. And so we can only ever get really to a fraction of them. So we'll have to start winding it down. And why don't we wind it down with a question here for Dan Chapa. This comes in from Randall Dobbins. And he says, or asks, how do non-determinists explain how a person can die, never hearing of Jesus, never have a chance to be saved if God doesn't determine who is to be saved?
Man, that's a really, really tough question.
These are deep questions.
So, I know that the common answer that folks on my side of the aisle, I guess, come up with is something like inclusivism rather than exclusivism. And I am not at all comfortable with that. I would rather say, God would send somebody to give them the gospel. God would send an angel to reveal the gospel to them. I think interestingly, I think the Job 33:16, where God whispers things in the ears through a dream, through a vision, maybe comes into play in a case like that. But the reality is, I'm not I'm not sure. I know that John 1:9 says that Christ enlightens every man that comes into the world. I know in Revelations it says that there will be people of every tongue, tribe, and nation in the great multitude in heaven. Now, how did that include, people from tongues and tribes and nations in Northern America before that went extinct and died out before Christ, the gospel ever got to them? I don't know. Somehow they're in there. But I don't have a great answer for you, Randall. So, man, I wish I had something solid to give you, but that's a really tough question for me, and I struggle with it personally.
Well, Dan, thanks so much for that response. Randall, thanks for the solid question. CJ, any thoughts on that?
Absolutely. The first question, or the first answer that I could give, is just that I don't actually have a clear answer, because even despite being a determinist, it doesn't seem to me, given the nature that God himself lays out in the Bible, that we can just say straight up, everybody who died without hearing the gospel is definitively lost. But I can't say that that there's something provided in the Bible that says they're saved either. It's a hard question, because it seems like, given God's own nature, Ezekiel 33:11, God is not willing that any should perish. It seems like that can't necessarily be the answer. But with that being said, if it is the answer, God is just in whatever it is that he does. Human beings are not deserving of salvation. That is a humanist line of thinking. We are given grace, and if we were deserving of it in any way, it would not be grace. We are actually quite foul as a species, and I think the Bible is certainly pretty clear on that. And to say that, like, well, yeah, they never heard, and somehow that's unfair. It's like, well, it's not really about fair, because if it was fair, I mean, humans are liars, humans are deceitful, I guess that's the same thing. Humans are violent. We care only about ourselves. We're selfish. You know what I mean? And we need to not think of things in terms of God isn't being fair to me, because you don't deserve squat. You don't deserve your next breath. You know what I mean? And God is gracious in giving it to you. And I think that's just something that we all need to come to terms with. You want to talk about a cynical book. The Bible is a cynical book, and rightfully so, because humans suck.
CJ, thanks so much. And Dan, question was for you, so you get the last word, my good man.
No, I mean, CJ is right. Shall not the judge of all the earth do right? Right. But I appreciate CJ. I mean, he could have gone for the jugular there, and he stuck with scripture. So I appreciate that.
Okay, gentlemen, again, fantastic job tonight. Excellent debate. Definitely rewatchable. I hope to do more debates on this topic. As people can see on the channel, I've got at least a dozen debates scheduled already for this month and then January. And we've got a solid mix, a little bit on creation, evolution, a little bit on soteriology, nature of God, topics such as this as well. The Bible translation issue. So one of these days, maybe we'll get a round 2 as well between CJ and Dan Chapa. So again, guys, thanks so much for a great debate. To the audience, thank you for all the support, the super chats, and of course the excellent questions. So Dan, CJ, what I like to do though before we completely shut it down is I have some final words and final thoughts. So Dan, this was your first time here, and it's obviously not going to be your last. You're going to be here in a week or two debating Turretin Fan on limited atonement. I'm excited for that. And then next month you'll be debating Joshua Gibbs on soteriology. So Dan, some final words, final thoughts, and thanks again for doing this.
Thank you again for having me and CJ, and it's just been a pleasure getting to know you, Donny, and I look forward to many more.
I appreciate it. I'm looking forward to it as well. CJ, I know you and I are in talks for a couple more debates as well. You've been here at least a dozen times, so I always appreciate your company here and your time. You always make for memorable debates. So CJ, thanks again, and final words, final thoughts.
Absolutely. Well, actually, I recently, because I have a playlist of my own debates. I don't know how many are on your channel or not, but we might be between 3 and 4 dozen at this point. Nevertheless, I appreciate you guys. This is a great conversation, and Lord willing, let's do something similar again sometime. And for the record, like I said to start this, as much as we all disagree about these sort of things, I do believe this is an in-house issue, and I appreciate I appreciate just having the conversation. I mean, we're going to have a whole eternity to discuss it at some point. So,
amen. Well said. Well said. It's always edifying and beneficial to, come together for these in-house debates, especially. So, okay. Well, with that being said, to anybody who's new to this channel, I've seen quite a few. Anthony here. I thought I saved your comment, but I don't see it now. But he pointed out he just found this channel today, and he's glad he did. And so I would just say anybody who just found the channel and you're a debate addict, like I think the three of us here on the show, click in the description box. You'll see debates hosted by Standing for Truth. Click that link, and it'll take you to a playlist of over 250 debates on all sorts of topics. So, okay, with that being said, Dan, CJ, thanks again. To the audience, thanks so much. We'll see you tomorrow night, 10 o'clock, for a debate on Is Oneness Biblical? Kelly Powers and John Barton. God bless all.